Hour Zero. Sitting in his office surrounded by his most trusted advisors, Xi Jinping feels ready. Over the past decade or more, he's spent billions upon billions modernizing China's military. His nation now has nuclear weapons, around 500 of them, and he's built one of the world's largest navies. Add to that the fact that China's military has more active members than any other nation, with 2.35 million people to call on. He's going to bring war to the United States. But to do so, he has to carefully coordinate attacks throughout the Pacific. He knows that the United States has bases in Japan and South Korea, around 190 in those two countries alone, and a powerful navy that, though smaller than his, packs a lot more firepower. A full frontal assault on the United States without taking care of those problems first would be suicide. He needs to secure the Pacific, giving China a route toward the American mainland as a priority. His attack doesn't begin with missile launches. It starts on the cyber front. For years, China has been working on cyber technology that would allow it to hack into American infrastructure and military defense systems, limiting America's response to an attack in the process. On occasion, China gets caught out. In December 2023, for instance, the United States conducted an operation to disrupt a network of small office home office or SOHO routers that China had taken control of using the KV botnet to mask its hacking activities. That was unfortunate for Xi, but it won't stop the first stage of his attack. Xi gives the okay and dozens of cyber attacks begin. Chinese hackers work feverishly, targeting American water systems, electrical grids, and communication systems, with a special focus on any that are located near key military installations. Further attacks take place within the networks of companies that provide critical services to America's military, as well as attacks on systems and transportation methods that will be used by the United States to deliver aid to Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion. That last step is critical. To reach the United States, China has to secure a passage through the Pacific. Taiwan, which China has claimed for decades should be part of the People's Republic anyway, is chosen as the main target. By securing that island, China can break through the nations in the Pacific that are allied to the United States, including Japan and South Korea, and clear its route to the American mainland. Hour 1. The United States is scrambling. It's no stranger to Chinese hackers, but it's never faced an operation of this scale before. The country's success against Volt Typhoon, the elite group of Chinese hackers that were responsible for the KV botnet attacks mentioned earlier, revealed that China has its fingers in major networks. Rail, mass transit, maritime, water, and pipeline systems were all under threat. And though Volt Tycoon has been mostly eradicated, the sheer scale of the disruption occurring in the US reveals that it was far from the only hacker group China had in play. America is left chasing shadows, at least for a couple of hours, which is all China needs to start the next stage of its assault. Xi Jinping gives the okay for the next and boldest part of its strategy: activating the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or PLARF. The group has around 120,000 members, who combine to operate 6 known ballistic missile bases throughout China. However, the PLARF's real strength lies in the sheer number of missiles it has at its disposal. Recent estimates from the US Naval Institute place the number at somewhere around 4,000, all of which are capable of targeting ships moving at sea in addition to static land-based targets. Both capabilities will be needed by Xi. In arranging this attack, he's had to make some difficult decisions. He knew that a launch against Taiwan was inevitable, and the island nation became his first target. A missile barrage begins, with air support being provided by the recently upgraded bases at Longqian, Jiangsu, and Wuhan. All three are supporting China with fleets of Shenyang J-16 fighters, launching missiles of their own while engaging Taiwanese defenses in the air. The tougher attacks focus on the US Pacific Fleet. Numbering around 200 ships, along with 1,500 aircraft and 150,000 military personnel, that fleet is the biggest barrier that stands in the way of Xi's ambitions to invade the United States. It covers almost half of the world's surface, stretching from Antarctica to the Arctic Circle, taking in the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean in the process. Xi can't hit everything in that fleet, but his goal is to strategically weaken the fleet in the early hours of his new war, eliminating America's ability to rapidly respond to his actions. To do that, he needs a 3-pronged missile attack. First, he has to engage the naval bases the United States has set up in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. It's a risky move. Any missile strike on these nations will surely cause collateral damage, potentially bringing all 3 of them into the war in support of the US. But failure to strike now means leaving nearly 200 bases ready to launch an immediate counterattack supported by around 79,000 troops. Xi can't take that risk. Hordes of Dongfeng 26 or DF-26 missiles are launched towards America's bases in Japan and South Korea. Each missile has a range of 2,485 miles, easily ensuring they can reach their targets. They are accompanied by shorter-range missiles, such as the DF-16, for a simple reason. Xi needs his DF-26s for attacks further afield. Those very missiles are also part of the second part of China's missile barrage, attacking closer to the United States. More are sent flying toward Guam, targeting the Andersen Air Force Base in Yago, as well as Naval Base Guam in Santa Rita. Xi also unleashes the new jewel in China's missile crown to strike Hawaii. The DF-27 is a hypersonic missile that can just about reach America's east coast and is capable of evading US missile defenses. It'll be Xi's chief weapon when attacking the American mainland, at least during the early stages of the war. Finally, the third strike, attacking American ships that are currently in the Pacific. Chief among the targets will be the small fleet of cruisers America has in the water near China, including the USS Shiloh and USS Mobile Bay. All told, there are 9 of these ships, all packed with heavy armaments and strong anti-air defenses that China hopes to either eliminate or damage heavily. Secondary targets include the much larger fleet of US Navy destroyers, which pack less of a punch than the country's cruisers but will still be enough to cause serious damage to the Chinese fleet if they're allowed to go unchecked. There are dozens to target, and Xi knows that he won't be able to take out all of them. But the more he can destroy with missiles now, the easier he'll find his invasion of Taiwan and subsequent passage to America. However, Xi's missiles won't have clear paths to their target. Though his cyber attacks have left the United States scrambling, it hasn't shut down the country's missile defense systems. America's DSP satellites, overseen by its Space Force, easily detect China's missile launches, giving President Joe Biden time to organize the country's defenses. Chief among these will be its ground-based interceptors, or GBIs, of which there are currently 44 active in the United States. Most of these systems, 40, are stationed in Alaska, though they're still capable of destroying intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, traveling at around 15,000 miles per hour. The other 4 are stationed in California, much closer to China's Hawaiian targets, and will be responsible for providing most of America's defenses against China's missile barrage. There's just one problem. What if any of the missiles contain nuclear warheads? Biden consults his advisors, who conclude that possibility is unlikely. American satellites show that the missiles are on course to hit its Pacific bases and Hawaii, suggesting a conventional strike. If Xi were going nuclear, his ICBMs would be on their way to Washington and other key strategic locations in the American mainland. Right now, the strategy is clear: evacuate troops from the anticipated strike zones and hunker down. A counterattack will come, but at present, the US has to rely on its missile defense systems. Across the Pacific, Xi watches and waits as the first of his missile barrages travel toward their targets in Japan and South Korea. Both have activated their missile defense systems to guard America's bases, with the platform they rolled out alongside the US toward the end of 2023, giving them advance notice of the missiles China has launched. Many get shot out of the sky, falling harmlessly into the Pacific, but the sheer number of Chinese missiles overwhelms the defenses. Okinawa is practically destroyed. As home to most of America's overseas military in Japan, it was the chief target of these strikes. At the Kadena Air Base, missiles rained down on F-15 Eagle fighters, E-3 Sentry planes, and KC-135 Stratotankers. The latter are especially important targets. They'll limit America's ability to refuel its aircraft in the air, restricting them to using the bases that China is so steadfastly attacking. The strike could be considered a success, killing thousands of American troops in the process. But Xi knows the bases aren't fully out of commission. He can't launch a ground-based invasion just yet, meaning the surviving crews at these bases will be able to rebuild quickly enough to continue to serve as launching points for the US Air Force. That's okay, he only needs them down for a few days. More missiles make their way toward cruisers and destroyers that the US has stationed in the Pacific. These ships are a little harder to strike, not least because they're not remaining still. Orders from American command have told all to start moving in erratic patterns, hoping to send Chinese missiles off course in the process. The tactic works in some cases, though not in others. China is successful in cutting down about half of America's cruisers, as well as several dozen destroyers. Again, a qualified success for Xi. A few minutes later, China's DF-27 and DF-26 missiles are drawing nearer to Hawaii. Dozens are shot out of the sky by California's missile defense systems, but they can't provide complete coverage. Many more break through, striking ships including the USS Frank E. Peterson and USS Hopper. Xi had hoped his strike would also take out at least some of the 13 submarines stationed in Hawaii, but no such luck. Even with his cyber attacks wreaking havoc, the commanders and crews of those submarines received orders to submerge underwater, safe from the missile barrage, until the US was ready to fight back. By the end of the first few hours of the conflict, China has expended nearly a quarter of its 4,000 missiles. It has wreaked devastation on the American bases in Asia, though at the cost of drawing Japan and South Korea into Xi's war. America's Pacific Fleet has been severely weakened, with Xi's cyber attacks also limiting the speed in which the US can respond to what he's going to do next. The strike's success wasn't total, but it was enough. Day 2. Having bought himself some time with his attack on the United States, leaving his main enemy in a temporary state of disarray, Xi can focus on his immediate target, Taiwan. China has spent the last day battering Taiwan with short-range missiles. The barrage has been successful in taking out several targets, including the smaller islands surrounding Taiwan, but it's also faced a steadfast defense from the US-made Patriot air defense system stationed on the island, as well as Taiwan's own Skybow surface-to-air ballistic missile defense systems. Still, the barrage will have to end soon, if only because Xi wants to send ground troops in to take the island. He can't risk killing his own people in friendly fire situations. After a 24-hour bombardment in which China expends hundreds of missiles, Xi assesses the damage he's caused. Crucially, his attacks on America's overseas bases, as well as America itself, will delay its navy in reaching the Taiwan Strait, and the missiles he's fired at Taiwan have severely weakened its naval defenses, while fighter planes from Longqian, Jiangsu, and Huan keep the country's air force occupied. He feels ready to start landing troops on the Taiwanese mainland, but therein he finds a problem. His landing options are limited. That's partially due to the actions of Taiwan's president, Tsai Ing-wen. She's been preparing for an attack from China for several months, especially in the wake of Beijing growing bolder by conducting military and naval operations in the Taiwan Strait. As soon as the missiles started flying, Tsai sent orders to defensive positions on both sides of the island. To the east, Taiwan benefits from having an extensive network of cliffs. Tsai anticipates that Xi will look to blockade that side of the island with his navy, but is unlikely to launch a full invasion from the east. Still, soldiers are placed on alert, telling them to prepare to fight against ground troops that might try to climb the cliffs, which have gradients of at least 15%. If need be, those troops will receive orders to destroy the routes built through the cliffs that lead to the mainland. Her main focus lies in Taiwan's west. As the coast closest to China, it's going to be the point of ingress into the island. Tsai places all 15 major ports and harbors on that coast on high alert, with orders for their destruction in place if China's forces get near. Tsai can't afford to allow China to set up a naval presence on the island itself if it manages to invade. Then there are Taiwan's beaches. All are heavily fortified, with any Chinese troops that manage to land having to make their way through scores of barbed wire-laden defenses just to achieve any hope of reaching the roads that lead to Taipei. The waters leading to most of those beaches are less than 50 feet deep, meaning China can't land troops en masse. It must take them most of the way before ferrying them across in smaller vessels, all while being subjected to missile fire from Taiwan. Those waters are also packed with shallow mines, with the beaches also containing anti-landing spikes that will prevent China's tanks from making inroads. And if worst comes to worst, Tsai can collapse the roads leading into Taipei from the west, forcing Chinese troops to navigate challenging terrain if they ever hope to reach Taiwan's capital. Tsai is going to make this a war of attrition, and that spells bad news for Xi. Day 3. The United States is almost ready to counter the initial Chinese offensive. But before it does, Biden puts on his diplomatic hat as he prepares to exploit a key weakness in Xi's plan. One of China's biggest challenges in the war is economic. The country relies heavily on importing goods, spending $2.56 trillion in 2023 alone. Biden has spent the last 3 days organizing heavy sanctions against China, with America's network of allies finally paying off. China will not only struggle to import goods and equipment from the United States, but it'll also be cut off from its European trade partners. All agree to not sell to or buy from China, essentially creating a blockade for as long as the war lasts. That blockade extends to oil. China imports 11.8 million barrels of oil per day to keep itself running. Much of that oil comes from Russia, which is now responsible for about 19% of the oil China buys annually. However, the other 81% comes from countries like Saudi Arabia, which are allied to the United States. Leveraging diplomatic pressure, as well as the concerns that other Asian nations such as Saudi Arabia have related to Chinese expansion, Biden is able to cut off most of the oil reaching China. Yes, Russia will supply Xi, though it isn't able to cover the massive shortfall that results from America's sanctions. And given Putin's war in Ukraine, he also can't risk Russia's trade with other countries for the sake of solely supporting China, especially given that he faces his own sanctions. Xi didn't expect this. Now he faces a shutdown. China has to defeat the United States in a matter of months, or else its resources will dwindle to the point where it's practically starved out of the fight that it started. Day 4. With sanctions in place and trade routes in the process of being cut off, Biden's next move is to speak to his allies in NATO. After all, China directly attacked America on its own soil by launching missiles at Hawaii. It also attacked America-owned military bases overseas, which would also constitute an attack on the US. All of this plays in Biden's favor for one reason: Article 5 of the NATO Charter. According to this article, if any NATO ally or member nation is the victim of an armed attack by another country, every other NATO member will consider this an act of violence against themselves. In short, China's attack on the United States has brought most of Europe into the fold. Biden has been cooperating with NATO members from the moment he detected China's missiles. Collectively, that makes him ready to utilize the power of 31 nations, including what's left of the United States defenses. The focal point of the counterattack is obvious: the Taiwan Strait. Xi has failed to take Taiwan with his missile barrage and now faces an extended conflict in which he's losing thousands of troops every day to his attempts to land on Taiwanese beaches. Even if he manages to break through Taiwan's defenses by simply throwing sheer numbers at the island, his troops will face an urban warfare campaign that will see them fight tooth and nail for every street they manage to claim. Xi didn't expect this. And this war of attrition all adds up to time that the US and its allies can take to prepare an attack. The strategy is to combine America's naval resources with those of its NATO allies, as well as the navies of South Korea, Japan, and Australia. The latter will also be a focal point of the counterattack, as China neglected to destroy the bases America has set up in Australia. The United States sends a fleet of ships, including most of its stock of 11 aircraft carriers, toward the Taiwan Strait. They're accompanied by one of the UK's aircraft carriers, the HMS Queen Elizabeth, loaded with Typhoon FGR-4 and F-35B Lightning jets. Similar support comes from Canada, which commits half of its 12 frigates to the American cause, as well as Japan, which sends most of its fleet of 36 destroyers. South Korea hesitates. It's happy to support the US in any way that it can, but it also has to be wary of North Korea, which could see China's attack as an opportunity for it to start a war with its southern neighbor. If South Korea commits its naval or aerial resources to America now, it leaves itself open to attack. Biden understands this, resulting in South Korea's role being to keep watch over North Korea to ensure it doesn't get involved in the conflict. And now the US has an allied fighting force that's capable of fighting against China in the sea or air. The fleet sets sail. Week 2. Xi has been bombarding Taiwan to no avail. Every attempt to land ground troops on Taiwan's beaches is met with missile strikes and fierce beach combat. Yes, he's slowly whittling away at those defenses, but for each victory he achieves, a road is destroyed or a tunnel collapsed by Taiwan, forcing his troops to divert over difficult terrain to get to Taipei. The few who managed to reach Taiwan's capital have been destroyed in urban warfare. This was supposed to be a quick victory. It had to be. Every day that China doesn't control Taiwan is another day in which American counteroffensives draw nearer. Finally, 2 weeks after his missile launches, Xi faces the prospect of American naval and aerial assets reaching the Taiwan Strait. Worse yet, they're supported by NATO and Japan, neither of which wants to see China gain more influence, be it in the Pacific or the Americas. Worse yet for China, its navy, though larger than America's, doesn't compare in terms of sheer firepower. Though Xi was successful in destroying almost 24 of America's destroyers in his missile barrage, that still leaves 68 to contend with, around 20 more than China has. And although China has more corvettes and patrol boats, neither will withstand the combined naval firepower being brought into the Taiwan Strait. Worse yet for Xi, America has an ace in the hole: its Rapid Dragon tactic. Over the past couple of years, the United States has been retrofitting some of its cargo aircraft so they're capable of dropping pallets of long-range missiles. Each pallet can be stocked up with 30 AGM-158 JASSM cruise missiles, which have a range of between 229 and 1,118 miles, depending on which version of the missile is launched. Stacked into America's MC-130J aircraft, which Xi didn't target as he didn't believe them to be a threat, these pallets start raining cruise missiles down onto the Taiwan Strait. Those missiles serve two purposes. If they hit a Chinese ship, their 990-pound WDU-42B penetrator warheads can easily destroy most targets. But even if they fail to hit, such a large barrage of missiles launched simultaneously will confuse the missile defense systems built into China's larger warships, as well as those in the 3 air bases that are the launching point for China's fighter jets. While the missile defenses are focused on a flurry of JASSM cruise missiles, more targeted strikes can take out targets. The Allied forces turn the tide in the Taiwan Strait. Month 2. Xi has lost the clear passage into Taiwan that he'd established during his initial invasion. He's still getting troops onto the mainland, though each landing is subjected to Taiwanese defenses along with assaults from the US and its allies' navies. Worse yet, he's lost air superiority. In truth, he never really had it. Taiwan's 142 F-16 fighter jets, many of which have been upgraded, may be technologically inferior to China's J-20s. The Infrared Search and Track, or IRST, built into the J-20s means that it's far more capable of tracking and eliminating a target than the F-16. But Tsai knew this, and knew that support was coming from the US. She's used her F-16s to delay rather than defeat China, just as she's used her beach and urban warfare tactics to keep China from sending hundreds of thousands of troops into Taipei. Now, the US and NATO are in the Taiwan Strait, and they're pushing Chinese forces back to their home country. Constant missile barrages on the Longqian, Jiangsu, and Huan air bases have rendered them practically unusable, making it a struggle for China to get new fighters into the air as quickly as it had managed before. America's aircraft carriers, of which it brings 8 to the Taiwan Strait, can each hold around 75 fighters, bringing the Allied forces to a total of 600 when at full capacity. Add to that the Rapid Dragon strategy, and America and its allies are shutting down every attack China attempts. It's not long before America's Navy cuts off the passage into Taiwan. Cut off from their target, China's naval and air forces begin a retreat, leaving the few thousand Chinese troops still in Taiwan stranded. They'll be picked off by Taiwan's forces in Taipei, assuming they get there. And with the US now firmly entrenched in the Taiwan Strait, it's able to land troops on the island's beaches to attack the remnants of China's forces from the rear. It's a lethal pincer movement that soon puts paid to Xi's invasion. Still, it hasn't all been clear sailing for the US. China has managed to use its strong submarine fleet, with its 6 Shang-class nuclear submarines leading the way, to take out 2 of America's aircraft carriers. It's a difficult loss, especially given that those carriers housed about 150 fighters between them. But America's submarines are just as lethal. Though it has fewer submarines than China, around 60 to China's 78, its crews are better trained and have fewer targets to strike. Both of China's aircraft carriers, brought into the conflict due to the American assaults on its air bases, are taken out, minimizing China's impact from the air. Xi has to face a very real possibility. He's about to lose this war. Month 3. China has stubbornly refused to give in to the overwhelming force being applied to it. The country's navy lies in tatters, with only a fleet of patrol boats guarding its coast to back the few corvettes and frigates it has left. Xi has called his ships back, anticipating an invasion by the United States into the Chinese mainland. Xi has failed to take Taiwan. And in attacking the United States directly, he's only discovered that America's NATO allies take Article 5 very seriously. The same goes for other allies, including Japan and South Korea, which have aided the US both because of their military alliances with the country and because neither wants to see the spread of Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific. Xi knows he's miscalculated. Now he faces a very big question. Does he launch nuclear weapons? China has around 500 nukes, as well as ICBMs, capable of reaching the continental United States. His country's CSS-4 Mod 2 Mod 3 missiles could do the job thanks to their 8,000-mile range. The DF-41 can also hit the mark, as it's capable of traveling nearly 7,500 miles. But Xi thinks better of it. Launching his nuclear weapons against the United States would mean a response in kind. and while America's Minuteman III ICBMs lack the range of his missiles, the country's submarines and aerial bombers could easily drop nukes all over China if provoked. Ultimately, China is forced to capitulate, though its military would prove a strong match for the United States alone and could even have the potential to defeat its American counterpart. It simply can't stand up to such a powerful united front. Taiwan proved stronger than Xi expected, with his failed invasion meaning plans to reach the American mainland never got off the ground. And with most of Europe, thanks to NATO, gunning for him, he can't escape the fact that he's been overwhelmed. Add to all of this the effects of the sanctions and trade blockades America created within days of him starting his war. They've slowly sapped the morale of the Chinese people, resulting in them being ready for surrender. America wins the war, but it's a win that came at a cost. It will take the US years to rebuild its war-torn navy, and along with its NATO allies, it will be heavily involved in imposing military restrictions on China for years to come. However, it's proven the impact that its cooperative approach to defense can have in a battle against one of its greatest rivals, putting any other major military power that might dare to attack the US on notice in the process. Of course, this is just one of many potential scenarios that could play out if China and the US went to war. It's also optimistic in favor of the US. But what could China do to prevent this series of events from happening? Would they happen at all, or do you think the US may struggle to receive the support it needs from NATO and its allies in Asia? As Putin paces his office, he is nervous. Despite his outwardly calm demeanor and projected strength on his state-controlled media outlets, he is a wreck in private. Since 2014, he has tried to take over Ukraine with no luck. In 2022, he launched a full-scale invasion of the country to decapitate the democratically elected government and install a Russian-controlled puppet. After launching his so-called special military operation that was supposed to take Kyiv in 3 days, he has been fighting a war of attrition against a nation that refuses to give in despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Even after spending tens of billions of dollars, losing more than 10,000 pieces of equipment and hundreds of thousands of soldiers, he is still not any closer to declaring victory than when he started. Because of his military's host of setbacks on the battlefield, Putin has turned to increasingly desperate measures to win the war. Recruiting convicted murderers, raising mercenary armies, conducting bombing campaigns against civilian targets, deporting masses of civilians to Russia, and other crimes that have done nothing but harden Ukrainians' resolve to win the war. And as Putin has tried various tactics to win the war, so too has the US and NATO done their part to help Ukraine succeed. Over the past several years, the US alone has contributed over $175 billion to Ukraine's war effort, with almost $70 billion of that being direct military aid in the form of all types of weapons and ammunition for land, sea, and air requirements. NATO countries have also given significant money, amounting to over $30 billion in economic aid and $40 billion in direct military aid. Because of the huge amount of Western aid flowing into Ukraine, Russian formations have been brought to a standstill due to a smaller army being able to force itself several orders of magnitude thanks to these weapons donations. And that's where Putin has a problem. Putin has routinely called for Western aid to stop flowing into Ukraine and has threatened several so-called red lines for aid that would trigger a larger response from him. Chief among these red lines has been the delivery of the F-16 fighter jet. Though the F-16 airframe is several decades old, modern midlife upgrade packages during the early 2000s brought these tried-and-true fighter jets into the contemporary era. With newly refurbished airframes, new radars, computers, weapons, and other sensors, the modern F-16 can go toe-to-toe with some of Russia's best aircraft, like the Su-34 and Su-35. This is a problem for Putin. Though Ukraine's air force remains viable after years of fighting, its role remains limited due to its small size, older planes, less advanced radars, and shorter-range weapons. As a result, the Ukrainian Air Force's sortie generation is sometimes up to 40 times less than Russia's ability to launch aircraft each day. However, thanks to the dearth of air defense systems that Western backers have provided, the Ukrainian armed forces are still able to contest the skies over Ukraine through a combination of short, medium, and long-range systems. However, recent developments may finally tip the balance of power in favor of Ukraine. Recent media reports show that Belgium has pledged to donate 30 of its surplus F-16 fighters in exchange for newer F-35s. This pledge has now pushed the total number of committed F-16s for Ukraine to 85. Though these planes may not arrive in theater for some months, or potentially years, due to retrofitting and pilot training, this number of F-16s is what Ukraine says it needs to gain local air superiority along a sector of the front. If Ukraine were to gain air superiority in a specific area, like Kherson for example, its forces could use this as a weapon to reel back Russian advances sector by sector until pushback to the 2014 line of contact, or potentially to the international border itself. Such a possibility is a disastrous scenario for Putin, and he would certainly choose a drastic course of action to prevent the defeat of conventional Russian forces on the battlefield. Another reason why Putin might make good on his promise to escalate the war is because of Ukrainian attacks on Russia itself. Over the past several years, Ukraine has attacked Russia numerous times with drones that have crippled air bases far inside Russia and resulted in some hilarious countermeasures like placing tires on top of multi-million-dollar airplanes to prevent their destruction. Recently, however, these attacks have ramped up to affect Putin's bottom line, his oil industry. Because Russia is essentially just a giant gas station that supplies huge quantities of oil and natural gas to the world, this serves as Putin's main way of obtaining foreign cash to back up his worthless rubles. Since January 2014, Ukraine has been attacking Putin's oil industry in earnest by launching at least 15 recorded drone attacks against oil refineries across Russia, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away from Ukraine. These attacks have crippled up to 14% of Russia's oil refining capacity at a time and forced Putin to announce a 6-month freeze on fuel exports to ensure price stability at home. Despite America's urging to stop attacking inside Russia, Ukraine continues its strikes unabated. As Putin's military struggles to shoot down these drones, it's a huge political embarrassment for him, since he has already stated that companies should seek to purchase their own air defense systems since the Russian military cannot afford to buy any more. If Ukraine continues these attacks, or they get worse and worse, this too might be the tipping point if public sentiment goes against him and he's seen as weak. Whether caused by a perceived loss on the battlefield or having his seat of power threatened at home, Putin would take drastic action to save his shattered dream of reinstating a modern USSR. But what would a war be like? Hour zero. As the West continues to watch the war in Ukraine unfold, Putin continues to make veiled threats in the media. While Putin has been saying these things for years, Western nations do not take him seriously anymore, since they assume he could not be so foolish as to start a peer-to-peer war with the US and NATO while still trying to conquer Ukraine. But that's exactly what Putin is planning. Thanks to Western preoccupation with Ukraine, Putin has been able to replenish his forces engaged in Ukraine with new ones. This is not uncommon for him, for since the war started, the Russian military has raised 2 new combined arms armies it has sent to Ukraine from a mixture of contract troops, volunteer groups, private military companies, and prisoners. Shifting these forces from the front lines to Belarus and northern Russia for rest and refit is a common occurrence now. This is because Russia has built up strategic-level reserves through Putin's crypto-mobilization efforts that target ethnic minorities, economically disadvantaged communities, and petty criminals, which brings in nearly 30,000 personnel each month. Of course, Ukraine inflicts around 1,000 casualties per day on the Russian military. Still, because of these mobilization efforts, Putin has steadily built up his current army from around 1.1 million troops to 1.5 million soldiers, due to around 300 to 400,000 Russians signing enlistment contracts each year, which is the target set by the former Russian Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu. With his new army of 400,000 troops, just over the size that Putin had used to invade Ukraine in 2022, Putin intends to deploy them in a surprise invasion meant to shock NATO into stopping support for Ukraine. But where would Putin strike? Though Putin might be mad, he does have some measure of realism in his body. Expecting the Russian army to muster enough personnel and material to invade the entirety of NATO is simply an absurd suggestion that even his staunchest supporters would advise him against. Instead, he intends a 2-pronged, limited invasion of Eastern Europe meant to fracture the NATO alliance and gain some territory for himself while he's at it. The most likely candidate for this strike would be the Baltics. The Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are the most exposed countries in the alliance and have a nasty history with Russia. After gaining independence after World War I, the USSR invaded and occupied these countries in 1940. After decades of communist rule, they were among the first socialist republics to declare independence and among the first to join NATO after the USSR fell. Because of their decades of Soviet rule, there are significant populations of ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people within these countries. Touting the same line of reasoning that he did with Ukraine, Putin would likely telegraph in the media that these countries were trying to abuse or somehow eradicate these ethnic Russian people. As Putin would have his press fear-mongering in the papers, trying to disrupt European governments like he always does, these 400,000 new troops would slip quietly into position in Belarus and the Western Military District of Russia. But what would Putin's strategic plan be? Though it's hard to speculate on the inner thoughts of a madman, it's likely that Putin would want to use his army quickly to overrun the Baltic countries before the US and NATO had a chance to respond. But in order to do so, he would need to cut off access to the Baltics through a strategic choke point called the Suwalki Gap. The Suwalki Gap is the unofficial name of a roughly 60-kilometer territory stretching from the Russian Kaliningrad exclave on the Baltic coast across the northeastern Polish border with Lithuania and stops in Belarus. This sparsely populated area is a critical choke point for the US and NATO alliance. Control of this area means that the Baltics are cut off from mainland Europe. Holding the line here for Putin would mean that he could block the expected NATO counterattack. At the same time, he consolidates control over the Baltics and forces the US and NATO to the negotiating table over Ukraine. But how would that invasion play out? Hour 1. As Putin launches his invasion, the first Russian troops to enter the Baltics and the Suwalki Gap are not conventional forces, but are actually Putin's little green men. Earning this moniker from the earlier invasion of Crimea in 2014 due to wearing Green Army uniforms with no insignia, these private military contractors are the advanced guard of Putin's army, meant to seize key objectives like bridges, roads, government buildings, radio stations, and military barracks to allow regular troops to enter freely. Instead of moving in regular army vehicles, the little green men instead ride in converted civilian 4x4 trucks, SUVs, and other commercial vehicles to try to blend in with the local population. Their goal is to seize their objectives through surprise and speed, so they want to avoid drawing attention to themselves as they cross the international border. Assisting these little green men in the first hour of the invasion is an extensive network of spies and collaborators Putin's security services have developed over the years. Because of the significant number of Russian minorities and former communists in the Baltics and other European countries, state intelligence and police services routinely make contact with these individuals via online platforms, social media, rallies, bars, concerts, and other traditional recruitment methods. By fostering relationships with disenfranchised locals who are sympathetic to Russia, Putin hopes that he can use them as on-the-ground intelligence when the invasion kicks off to serve as guides for the little green men, spot targets for Russian aircraft, and relay NATO troop movements to Russian forces. As the little green men encounter their first NATO checkpoints, the troops wonder what the heck is going on here. Though there is frequent movement in these countries due to the nearly 10 brigades of Baltic and NATO forces stationed there, US and NATO troops do not travel with firearms in personal vehicles. But before they realize what's happening, it's too late, as these men quickly overwhelm border checkpoints across the Baltics. After securing these border checkpoints and other vital objectives within several kilometers of the border, the little green men signal to conventional Russian formations to begin driving inland. While waiting in formations on the Russian side of the border under the protection of camouflage netting and GPS jammers, Russian armored and mechanized units begin lurching forward to advance into the Baltics. Their objective is similar to trying to take Kyiv. Since Kyiv is roughly 210 kilometers from Russian territory, the Russian High Command hopes to replicate the failed invasion attempt on Kyiv by driving straight towards the capital cities of Riga and Tallinn, which are about 200 kilometers from the Russian border. However, Lithuania's capital city, Vilnius, is only about 40 kilometers from the Belarusian border. Because of its close proximity to Belarus, Putin's generals hope to arrive in Vilnius by the first day and the other two capitals by day 3. As Putin's armored columns begin to traverse the Baltics, they encounter scattered resistance for the first hour. However, after overcoming the invasion's initial shock, resistance becomes more organized and coordinated among the NATO defenders. They know they cannot hope to fight and win against the Russians all by themselves. They are hoping to buy enough time for US and NATO reinforcements to come and roll the Russians back to the international borders of Russia and Belarus. But NATO ground troops aren't the only ones getting clobbered in the first hour of Russia's invasion. Putin knows that to win this war, he needs to secure the Baltics and close the Suwalki Gap within a week. Anything longer than a week, and he runs the risk of not only general mobilization of NATO countries, but also the threat of massive American reinforcements crossing the Atlantic. But crossing the Atlantic will take a week, and this does not account for the several days of mobilizing and loading American ships before the journey. Because of this, he intends to target bases where NATO's Rapid Response Force intends to mobilize first. NATO's Rapid Response Force is the premier organization within NATO, intended to rapidly deploy to crisis zones within hours or days, depending on the need. This force is comprised of land, air, and sea assets that combine troops from across every NATO country into a combined arms army that can sustain operations for several months without needing reinforcements for resupply. At the beginning of the invasion, about 50,000 NATO rapid response forces were forward deployed in the Baltics, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. About 30,000 of these troops were stationed in the Baltics. The bulk of the rapid response force is stationed in Poland, with around 100 members there as of May 2024, and the rest are stationed throughout Europe, with the bulk of the remaining personnel, air assets, and supply bases stationed in Germany. It's these major troop concentrations in Germany and Poland that Russia wants to knock out before they are mobilized for the rescue of the Baltics. Russia intends to eliminate these groupings through the use of long-range precision fires. Though the fog of war prevents accurate data from coming out, it's known that Russia maintains one of the world's largest inventories of conventional missiles. With close to 24 missile types of all varieties, the missile threat posed by Russia, even after years of conflict in Ukraine, should not be underestimated. In fact, despite sanctions, Russia has continued to maintain the inventory of its conventional short, medium, and long-range missiles. In attacking NATO positions in Poland and Germany, Russia would conduct a multi-tiered attack coming from different directions. For longer-range targets up to 2,500 kilometers away in Germany, like the Ramstein air base, Russia would launch a barrage of Kh-55, Kh-101, and Kalibr cruise missiles from the Kaliningrad exclave, Belarus, and Russian ships in the Baltic Sea. For targets in Poland, like the US Army base at Poznan, Putin could use the hypersonic Kinzhal missile, with a max range of around 500 kilometers, in addition to medium-range ballistic missiles and repurposed air defense missiles like the S-300 or S-400. In addition to these missiles, Russia would certainly launch hundreds of Shahed-136 drones. The Shahed drones, known as kamikaze drones in the media, are one-way attack drones meant to blow up targets on impact. Since the war in Ukraine started, Russia has bought thousands of these drones from Iran and has even created a factory in southern Russia to build thousands more to meet Russian military demand. Because of the Shahed-136's extensive range, around 2,500 kilometers, the Russians can use them when attacking faraway targets with long-range ballistic missiles. Due to this fact, the Russians have changed their tactics to include Shahed drones as a sort of diversion in multi-layered, multi-threat air attacks. The purpose of using a bunch of Shahed drones would be to confuse NATO radar systems and waste precious time and ammunition shooting these down while much larger missiles come in for the kill. But much to Putin's surprise, his barrage of hundreds of long-range missiles and drones has little effect on NATO defenses. This is due to the integrated air defense network the US and NATO has spent decades building across Europe. The integrated air defense network currently in place is the most sophisticated in the world. Beginning with ground radar sites, almost every NATO country has at least 3 ground-based radar sites, with some countries having as many as 10. These radar sites all operate at various ranges, frequencies, and elevations to capture data on threats flying in at any level and any profile. In addition to this robust network of radar sites, the NATO alliance has something Russia does not: an advanced airborne early warning system. Known as the E-3 Sentry, these Airborne Early Warning Command and Control Planes, or AWACS for short, are the eyes and ears of NATO in the sky. These Boeing aircraft have a massive radar dome that allows US and NATO forces to see threats up to 400 kilometers away. With just 3 of these aircraft, they can provide an overarching picture of Central Europe. With 14 total AWACS in service, which does not even include the ED Hawkeyes from any American carrier strike group nearby, the alliance can see these missiles coming a long way away. As the AWACS and ground-based radar stations throughout the Baltics, Poland, Germany, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and others pick up Russian missiles, this information is shared with the battle management coordinators in Germany. As this information is fed to Allied commanders in real time through secure data links, NATO forces are able to begin striking down these targets. As NATO's short, medium, and long-range anti-air fires begin taking out incoming Russian missiles, F-15s, F-22s, and F-35s, along with other Allied aircraft, begin scrambling from air bases across Europe to intercept these threats. While the ground-based defenses are worried about the ballistic missile threats, the aircraft will take over, shooting down the incoming drones. And the result is not good for Russia. Just like what happened in the Middle East earlier this year, even this advanced multi-threat attack was almost entirely defeated. While a handful of hundreds of drones and missiles fired by Russia make it through, few actually strike their targets. This is because Russian precision munitions is more of a suggestion than a fact. The war in Ukraine has shown that Russian precision weapons are more of a fairy tale than reality. While estimates vary due to the fog of war, some show that Russian missile attacks are routinely 30 feet to more than 3/4 of a mile off. On average, such inaccuracies are seen about 40% of the time for all Russian missiles. With such a high margin of error, the missiles and drones that somehow make it through NATO's air defense network cause little damage and few personnel casualties. Overall, major bases like Ramstein, Stuttgart, and Poznan continue operations as usual. Hour 2. After the first wave of Russian missile attacks failed, US and NATO aircraft began setting up combat air patrol stations throughout Poland and the Baltics to build a protective screen while more reinforcements arrive. As Allied pilots arrive, they find that the skies are eerily empty. Though scanning for some of Russia's best fighter aircraft to intercept, like the Su-34 or Su-35, Allied aircraft instead establish communications and begin conducting close air support missions for garrisons surrounded by Russian troops. But where is the Russian Air Force? Due to the intensity of Ukrainian air defense systems, the Russian Air Force almost categorically refuses to enter frontline combat. So what do? Instead of setting up rival combat air patrol stations or conducting strategic strikes deep within NATO territory, Russian combat aviation instead hangs back behind the front lines and lobs air-launched cruise missiles into the fray. Why they do this is for several reasons. For one, Ukraine has proven that Western anti-air defense systems are, without a doubt, the best in the world. Between the variety of short-point defense systems to Patriot, IRIS-T, and everything in between, Russia's air forces suffered heavy losses to these systems and cannot afford to take much more. This is because the high sortie rate in Ukraine has put excessive hours on Russian aircraft frames and make them capable of flying less hours. In addition, Russian pilots have less experience dogfighting than their NATO counterparts due to serving as missile lobbers for the last few years. The new pilots do not get training to fight like Western pilots. Instead, as NATO aircraft enter Polish and Baltic airspace, the skies are void of Russian aircraft, but thick with anti-air defenses and missile fire. Because Putin wants to preserve his air force, he holds them back behind this massive screen of air defense systems. While some Allied aircraft are able to score hits on these missile sites, the strength and depth of enemy air defenses, which includes missile sites within Russia and Belarus that fire with impunity, start wreaking havoc among NATO aircraft. Though NATO Air Force commanders asked to fire on these SAM sites in Russia and Belarus, the Supreme Allied Commander orders them to stand down for now. At this moment, they want to limit this war to include only the borders of NATO countries and not fire into Russia or Belarus. However, NATO headquarters in Brussels calls an emergency meeting with European heads of state to discuss a way forward. During this conference call, President Biden, alongside most NATO partners, agreed that US and NATO forces should not fire into Russia or Belarus. While some disagree, like the heads of state of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the reasoning is that the war should be limited to the confines of NATO territory and not Russia or Belarus to give Putin the propaganda victory of somehow saying NATO had attacked Russian territory first to justify the invasion. Instead, the Supreme Headquarters decided to send a naval force to the Baltics to provide air cover for its fighters so they could attack Russian columns. Up in the North Sea, the orders arrive at the flagship of the standing NATO maritime group to make best speed for the Baltics. The transit to get there will take just over 2 days until their Aegis missile system can be in range to start detecting missiles and shooting them down. But the Russian Navy has other plans. Due to the emissions control conditions set by this surface action group, Russian forces in Kaliningrad were unable to get an accurate fire control solution with missiles. Instead, they sent orders to their submarines to take out any Allied warships making their way to the Baltics. These orders reach the commander of a Yasen-class submarine as she picks up the acoustics of warships nearby. The Yasen-class submarine is one of the most advanced submarines in the Russian arsenal. Due to its heavy armaments of torpedoes and cruise missiles and its stealth technology, it's very difficult for any ship to pick up on her. As the lead ship of the formation closes her, the Russian submarine fires a spread of torpedoes. The sailors on board the American destroyer have just seconds to react before several torpedoes close in on her wake and slam into her stern. Though the sailors on the Russian submarine rejoice in their first kill of the war, they do not know that they are now the hunted ones. The other ships in company pick up on the acoustics of the enemy submarine and begin to close in. A circling P-8 Poseidon aircraft, along with 2 MH-60 Romeo helicopters equipped with dipping sonar, begin prosecuting her position. Within a matter of minutes, the crew of a nearby destroyer has a positive firing control solution and conducts an urgent attack on the Russian sub. Before she knows it, 3 torpedoes come at her, and the Russian sub tries to do an emergency dive to avoid them. However, it's too late. On board the American destroyer, the sonar technicians hear the sound of 4 underwater explosions. On the surface, oil slick and human remains float to the surface. The American Navy has now drawn first blood. As the US and NATO ships of Snigem 1 resume their transit to the Baltic Sea, the situation on the ground is becoming grave in the Baltics. Russia committed about 100,000 soldiers to each of its objectives. On the ground, NATO troops are outnumbered by a factor of almost 4 to 1. The Russian armored columns began advancing toward them after the little green men pushed through the initial border areas. However, due to the chaos of the situation, the defenders are able to form hunter-killer teams to take out Russian armor columns due to the abundance of Javelin and other personal anti-tank weapons. As NATO troops begin to take out more Russian armored vehicles, it appears they have the upper hand. As Russian armored convoys are attacked from the sides and the rear, they stop and dismount their infantry to take out NATO anti-tank gunners harassing them. When they do so, the columns become vulnerable to precision fires in the form of Excalibur GPS-guided artillery shells, HIMARS rockets, and other advanced weapons. As US and NATO forward observers call in these fire missions on exposed Russian columns, they watch in anticipation as they see and hear rounds coming in. However, what happens next surprises them. As round after round of GPS-guided munitions fall in close to the Russians, it appears that in the last moments, these rounds fly wildly off course. While some of them hit close enough to cause casualties, the bulk of the Russian columns remain untouched. But how can this be? As the war in Ukraine has demonstrated, the Russian military has proven itself capable of learning from at least some of its mistakes. One of these critical mistakes was not having enough protection for its units from precision-guided munitions. As a result of being pummeled by Ukraine for the last couple of years, Russia has actually invested heavily in new electronic warfare technology that's been capable of defeating some Western weapons. Reports from Ukraine have shown that in some cases, the effectiveness of Western precision-guided weapons fell below 10% as a result of Russian jamming. Because of this, Putin has mandated that all important Russian formations and objectives be shielded with GPS jammers to render these Western weapons useless. However, he failed to realize that electronic warfare has other spectrums too. Russian communications is one of the spectrums that the US and their NATO allies soon exploit. As their performance in Ukraine has shown, the Russian military is practically incapable of securing their communications or using proper emissions control techniques to mask their plans. There exists online literally thousands of hours of recorded phone calls by Russian soldiers on unencrypted commercial cell phones discussing sensitive military operations. In addition to this, Russian troops frequently communicate in the clear on radio frequencies that are unencrypted. While they do change radio frequencies often, there is also evidence of Ukrainian civilians intercepting Russian communications and harassing them. While these make for some good internet comedy, this inability to communicate securely has real-world consequences. Russian troops in the Baltics soon learn that their air defenses have beaten back Allied planes for now. NATO soldiers know exactly where Russian formations are, since they do not even attempt to hide their communications. With this real-time intelligence, US and NATO troops conduct numerous fire missions with traditional tube artillery, self-propelled artillery, and mortars to at least delay, if not stop, Russian advances. Though outnumbered for now, troops in the Baltics know help is on the way due to the mobilization of NATO's Rapid Response Force. Hour 8. Since the Russian invasion began just after dawn, the defenders in the Baltics have successfully prevented the Russians from making major gains. Though Vilnius is within range of Russia's artillery, rockets, and other indirect fire systems, the capitals of Estonia and Latvia remain free from attack, since the fighting is still concentrated within 20 kilometers of the border, or at least NATO thought. Throughout the day, Russian transport helicopters have made their way through a hail of NATO air defenses to land elite airborne and Spetsnaz special forces at airports just outside all three capitals. On the ground, local garrisons have brought down large numbers of helicopters from short-range man-portable systems like Stinger and Starstreak. However, enough helicopters have made it through to land inside each capital. The goal of these airborne operations is simple. The Russians hope to surprise the defenders and overwhelm them in a sharp, quick action. Once done, they will radio for more, waiting for transports to fly in larger numbers of paratroopers and conventional infantry to establish a land bridge in the city so that the Russians can now attack from two directions. But there is a problem with that. Because this is the same tactic Russia tried in Kyiv, the NATO troops defending in the Baltics anticipated this move and have been preparing to shoot them down. Through withering ground fire, a few helicopters managed to land at each airport. However, in short order, the attackers are wiped out by infantry stationed at the airport. Mopping up operations will continue for several more hours, but the immediate danger is now over. But where are the reinforcements? Back in Poland, the bulk of the 100,000 NATO troops have received their equipment and are on the march towards the Suwalki Gap. Russia, for its part, conducted a two-pronged invasion from both Kaliningrad and Belarus to shock the defenders there and rapidly seize the gap to begin fortifying it before help could arrive. Stationed in the gap are about 30,000 Polish and NATO soldiers, well armed with hundreds of tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and air support from several nearby air bases. However, during the initial bombardment, this area bore the brunt of the bulk of Russia's short and medium-range missiles from multiple angles. As a result, units stationed here suffered moderately high casualties in the first hours that have degraded their combat effectiveness. Making the situation worse is the fact that Russian air defenses have essentially created a wall of steel that's been difficult for Allied air forces to penetrate. As a result, the forces here are largely on their own and face the largest number of Russian and private military troops as they attempt to stem the tide of the invasion. But they do have one thing on their side. Due to the terrain, the area is heavily forested and there are not many major roads. Due to this, the Russians are forced to use the few roads there are for their armored vehicles, which makes them easy targets for indirect fire and anti-tank teams. But despite inflicting heavy casualties, the Russians rapidly advance due to overwhelming numerical superiority. At this point, US and NATO commanders have a decision to make. With the Navy still almost a day away, there will not be enough top cover to protect Allied planes from attack, and with the 100,000-strong response force still about half a day away, drawing equipment from Poznan, the commanders decide that the best course of action is to wait and stay where they are. Though they cannot trade space for time, they simply have no other option. Back in Brussels, the US and NATO leaders decide to hold a high-level war council about what to do next. It's agreed that, as previously stated at the Vilnius summit in 2023, the Baltics will not be abandoned, to be retaken at a later date. Instead, the strategy is to hold the area for as long as possible until reinforcements arrive from North America and the UK. In the meantime, NATO countries agreed to mobilize 25% of their militaries for war and place them under a unified American command. With such a decision, the US would have 850,000 personnel, 881 fighter aircraft, over 3,000 tanks, and 687 ships, among other equipment. Once assembled, these forces will begin an immediate counteroffensive, while the bulk of the US military arrives from North America to provide a strategic reserve and much-needed firepower. After deciding on a firm course of action, President Biden informs Congress that the United States is invoking Article 5 of the NATO treaty and that the country is now in a state of war with Russia. He then asks the Congress to officially vote on the matter. In an unusual sign of bipartisan support, Congress declares war on Russia and states that the war will end only when all NATO territory has been regained. With war now being declared, the president has numerous powers he could choose to mobilize the country. Among these is requisitioning the 181 ships of the US Merchant Marine to be under the control of the Military Sealift Command. Also in his power is the ability to charter commercial cargo planes for military use. Overnight, FedEx, UPS, and the Postal Service are all mandated to carry military cargo to help ferry the invasion force to Europe. But the question is, will there be anything left to defend once they get there? Day 1. In the first 24 hours after the start of the invasion, the Russian military made some decent progress. It's currently about 10 kilometers from Vilnius, and the city is experiencing intense indirect fire and air attacks. In Latvia and Estonia, the Russian gains have been greater, since the NATO force of about 10 brigades has had to defend an area the size of West Germany. As a result, the furthest afield Russian units have made it about 30 kilometers. But there is just one problem. Because Russia anticipated to have advanced much further than it did, Russian commanders had not stocked units with enough fuel and ammunition since they had planned on capturing NATO stocks. With Russia still fixed in place to contain Ukrainian forces, not enough fuel and ammunition has been spared. With Russian supply lines dangerously exposed from their railheads in northwest Russia and Belarus, truck convoys must continually make trips to the front lines to deliver supplies. And this is where Russian command and control hurts them. Due to having just 2 serviceable airborne early warning aircraft similar to the AWACS, the A-50, Russian commanders are blind to most of what's going on in front of them. Because of this, Allied units are frequently able to fix Russian units in place with snipers and small squads, while larger formations are able to flank around and attack Russian troops from the side or rear. Because of these frequent ambushes, senior Russian commanders become impatient and routinely head to the front lines to figure out what's going on. Due to their unencrypted communications, they become easy targets for Allied gunners or aircraft. Despite this, the Russian army continues to advance, since they're doing their best to bypass hardpoints and instead send second-line conscripts and prisoners to fight positional battles, while contract troops and private military contractors form the spearhead to push toward the capitals. Because of the Russians' rapid advance in Lithuania, the troops in the Suwalki Gap are quickly becoming surrounded on 3 sides. Fortunately, help is on the way soon. Day 2. As Snigum 1 comes around Denmark and makes a beeline for Poland, the group has been continually harassed and attacked by Russian fighter aircraft. Thankfully though, none of the missiles fired at US or NATO ships have hit due to how good Aegis has been. But what scares US commanders is as they get closer to Kaliningrad, they will sail under a gauntlet of missile fire. But thankfully, the group has an ace up their sleeve. Because of the presence of a US aircraft carrier, the carrier aircraft comes equipped with its own fighters, airborne early warning aircraft, and electronic attack aircraft. These electronic attack aircraft, known as the FA-18 Growler, are equipped with electronic jamming pods and HARM missiles, which are radar-seeking munitions used to target surface-to-air and anti-ship cruise missile sites. As the cruisers and destroyers of the NATO strike group provide protection for the Growlers, they close in on Kaliningrad with one mission: clear the way for the fighters and ships to go through. As the Growlers near the exclave, Russian fighter jets scramble to meet them. However, land-based F-35s and F-22s join the Navy F-18s to establish local air superiority. After downing dozens of Russian aircraft, the Growlers close in for the kill. True to their mission, their missiles home in on radar sites all across the exclave, making the Russians there virtually blind. With the air lanes now clear, the whole might of American air power begins pounding the exclave. Every available type of aircraft begins dropping bombs. By the end of the day, the vast majority of their air defense missile sites have been destroyed, their stockpiles of long-range missions have been wiped out, and the surviving Russians holed up in underground bunkers wait for the day to pass. But that day would not come, thanks to the Navy. With the sea lanes now clear from anti-ship cruise missiles, the US Navy and its allies close in closer to shore. Though Kaliningrad has been rendered combat ineffective, Russian air defense sites still operate with impunity across Russian territory and Belarus. Because of this, if Allied planes want to safely support the counteroffensive, the Navy will need to provide mobile air defense for them. Back on land, the fight is not looking good for NATO. Russian forces have advanced more than 60 kilometers across the Baltics and are now fighting in the suburbs of Vilnius. In the Suwalki Gap, NATO troops are doing their best to defend against a multi-axis attack. However, despite inflicting heavy losses on Russian troops, fresh units are brought in from Belarus. Additional Russian units also drove right past Vilnius and banked hard to the south to surround survivors in the area. However, Russia is doing its best to force them out with a brutal tactic. Because Russian combat aviation does not like to engage in dogfights, they mostly stick to fire support roles. One of the main ways they have done this in recent years is through the use of CAB 500 glide bombs. These bombs are thermobaric munitions that create massive blasts that, in the words of Ukrainian defenders, turn everything into cinders. With these nasty vacuum bombs, Russian combat aviation slowly dismantles NATO hardpoints and allows Russian troops to advance, but they're still not there yet. This is because the advanced units of the 100,000-strong relief force have made contact with the enemy. During their forced road march, US and NATO units forced running gun battles with Russian forces as they made their way to the Suwalki Gap. However, these units do not want to become encircled themselves and instead slow the pace of their advance, since it's unclear still if Russian troops will invade Poland from another direction to try and outflank the relief force. The slow movement of the relief force could spell disaster for the troops in the Suwalki Gap. With just 20 kilometers left on either side of them before being cut off, the danger of encirclement grows each day. That is, until the Navy arrives. Day 3. After clearing the Kaliningrad exclave, Snigem 1 has finally closed with Poland and the Baltic countries and is providing air defense support for Allied planes. With more than 300 vertical launch cells between them all, the Navy has done great work shooting down threats heading towards Allied planes and troop concentrations. However, this is not the only thing the Navy is doing. With almost 200 Tomahawk missiles between them, the Navy begins conducting fire missions on land to support the counteroffensive. Russian command and control centers, repair depots, armored columns, troop concentrations, and ammunition depots all become prime targets for Navy Tomahawks. However, with the inability to reload missiles at sea, Navy ships have to choose their targets wisely in such a rich environment. And though the Navy may have thought their part was done, the Russians had a surprise for them. While the Russians used Shahed drones in the opening salvos and throughout the first few days of the war, they now want to attack the US and NATO fleet with a swarm attack, never before seen in naval warfare. Launching hundreds of Shahed drones at the fleet offshore, the purpose is not necessarily to sink the Allied fleet, but to get them to expend enough ammunition to force them to pull back from the Baltic Sea for rearming. Throughout the third day, the ships of the combined US-NATO fleet fight their hardest day at sea yet. Hundreds of Shahed drones swoop in and try to take them out. After nearly 8 hours of continuous attacks, the crews are exhausted, and the damage to the fleet is extensive. Multiple ships suffered hits that caused fires, damaged equipment, and killed or injured crew members. Because of this, the Supreme Allied Command ordered Snigem 2 to head towards the Baltic at the best speed. It was already doing so, but it would take another half day to get there, just in time for what the Russians wanted. Though not a surprise to the US, the Baltic Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy has been shadowing the American Navy. Keeping outside of range, the Russians have been waiting for the Shahed drone attacks to weaken the US NATO fleet before coming in for the kill. Knowing that help is on the way, the Russians decide to strike. The resulting engagement is the largest naval battle since World War II. More than 60 ships and several hundred aircraft participate. Throughout the day, Russian ships launch missile after missile at the US ships. With just seconds to respond, the US fleet shoots down most, but some ships, weakened by previous battle damage or out of missiles, are lost. Thankfully, as it appears the US forces might be done for, the second strike group arrives within range and begins firing naval strike missiles along with AGM-158 joint air-to-surface standoff missiles. The Baltic Sea Fleet is quickly turned into sinking hulks and breaks engagement with the US fleet. With US submarines pursuing the survivors to keep them away, US and NATO ships now rule the Baltic Sea. Day 4. After the US Navy won the day yesterday, the victory is short-lived. Back in the Suwalki Gap, American commanders are faced with a difficult decision. With US and NATO troops now surrounded on 3 sides, Supreme Allied Headquarters makes the difficult decision to abandon the Suwalki Gap and reconstitute the survivors with the now fully arrived Rapid Response Force for a counteroffensive. But the Baltics have not been abandoned. In the Baltics, the defenders continue to hold on to Vilnius as vicious street fighting continues. In the north, Estonian and Lithuanian defenders have traded more time for space, but still only have about 100 kilometers left before Russians are knocking at the gates of the capital. To bolster support for the Baltics, the Navy sends another strike group to provide around-the-clock air cover and support for the trapped defenders. In addition to this, the Marine Corps and the Army do something that's not been seen since World War II. With nearly 10,000 US and European Marines ready to go, the decision is made to send them into the fight. Though Russia tries to stop them, the Marines land unopposed behind friendly lines and head towards the fight. In addition to the Marines, the US Army conducts the largest airborne drop since World War II, when the soldiers of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, along with elements from other NATO countries, launched the largest airborne assault since World War II. Now, with close to 20,000 reinforcements and a naval task force behind them, the defenders of the Baltics fight even harder to hold on. Day 7. Since reinforcements have been sent to the Baltics, the situation has stabilized there. Russian forces are advancing only gradually now, at just a kilometer or 2 per day, but in some cases, they are advancing just a few hundred meters. Because of this, Russian troops are digging in to defend the territory they have taken in Estonia and Latvia. In Lithuania, heavy street fighting continues. Scenes there are reminiscent of the battle for Bakhmut, with nearly every building destroyed by shellfire and Russian drones continually harassing Allied troops. Thankfully, due to the support of the Navy, NATO air forces totally dominate the skies. With round-the-clock close air support, the beleaguered defenders know that eventually the Russians will give up. Putin becomes increasingly frustrated with the situation. He sees the disaster that befell him trying to take Kyiv happening again, and the problem only gets worse when Ukraine does something unexpected. Agreeing to help relieve the pressure in Poland and the Baltics, Ukraine launches an unplanned counteroffensive in Kherson. Russian forces there, mostly conscripts and convicts, stripped of heavy weapons and equipment for the fight in the Baltics, flee for their lives. The war in Ukraine is now a war of movement once more. Within a matter of days, the Russian front line in Kherson collapsed due to the arrival of F-16s and a reinvigorated army that saw victory as close at hand. As the Russians abandon Kherson Oblast and flee to Crimea, President Zelensky asks for help in retaking Crimea since it's now or never. However, the US-led coalition denies this request. But why? At this moment, Biden is still seeking to avoid this becoming a world war. As it stands, the Russians have already failed to take any major cities in the Baltics, and the Rapid Response Force is making steady gains each day to retake the Suwalki Gap. With Kaliningrad Oblast being neutralized as an offensive force and Ukraine regaining Kherson, the president does not want to further escalate the war by assisting Zelensky in retaking Crimea. Besides, he couldn't even if he wanted to. This is because Turkey, though a NATO member, still controls the Bosphorus Strait because of the Montreux Agreement. This landmark agreement allows Turkey to close off the straits during times of war. However, despite Turkey now being at war with Russia, it too sees allowing NATO ships to retake Crimean land as too escalatory. Turkey also sees the writing on the wall and does not want to see the damage come to the Black Sea, since this would severely hurt the economies of several NATO members, including Romania and Bulgaria. However, Ukraine is not the only other outside theater in this war. Week 2. 1 week ago, the American fleet set sail for Europe. The massive convoy was loaded down with more than 100,000 soldiers, sailors, marines, and airmen from both the US and Canada. Due to the threat of Russian submarines, the American convoy, which numbers around 100 ships, including transports, oilers, cargo vessels and warships, did not travel in a straight line. Instead, the force zigzags erratically, hoping to throw Russian firing control solutions off. However, despite having air cover from a carrier strike group, several Russian submarines infiltrate the formation and begin firing. Several cargo ships go down, while American and Canadian warships fire torpedoes and anti-submarine rockets at their foes. After a short battle, the joint US-Canadian force sinks several Russian submarines. But as the convoy continues to Europe, US intelligence wonders how these submarines got so far into the Atlantic despite the naval blockade in the North Sea. The answer to that is Africa. Since around 2019, Russia has been actively involved in Africa, though they have mainly kept a low profile for the first few years. After the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, Russian PMC groups, most notably Wagner, began ramping up their efforts to court any half-wit dictator and war criminal that would hear them out. Over the past several years, Russian PMCs have seriously ramped up or begun new quote-unquote advising missions in countries like Libya, Sudan, the Central African Republic, Mali, and others. The main reason for this is the economic exploitation of these countries, where dictators give away key mining, manufacturing, publishing, and other industries that Russian oligarchs can take over. Of course, Putin gets his fair share of the profits, and this foreign cash, especially gold and oil revenue, is used to bolster his foreign reserves and help sanction-proof his empire. While the bulk of the attention in the media has been on Russian war crimes throughout Africa, one thing that Western governments failed to notice was the massive buildup of Russian arms and bases in Libya. Russia has recently courted the commander of the Libyan National Army, the terrorist army fighting the true Libyan government, to have a naval base at Tobruk in exchange for money, equipment, and fighters. With a naval base on the Mediterranean, the Russian Navy can send its submarines into the Atlantic, while the bulk of the NATO alliance is fighting pitched naval battles in the Baltic Sea or patrolling the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap to prevent Baltic Sea submarines from accessing the North Atlantic. This will have to be dealt with soon. Back on mainland Europe, the majority of the entire 300,000 Rapid Response Force has been issued equipment and has joined the fight. The Marine and paratrooper reinforcements have helped the Baltic defenders greatly. Though the Russians continue to try and punch through NATO defenses there, they run into a wall of steel every time. But there are a few problems. A massive air bridge must link Germany and Poland, with the trapped defenders in the Baltics to keep them supplied. More than 1,000 US and NATO transport aircraft are mobilized for this effort to fly in hundreds of tons of food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies each day. The Navy also regularly sends transports ashore to pick up the most seriously wounded and take them back to safety. But this might all end soon. Russian air, missile, and drone attacks are constant. They're trying their best to shake the Navy off the coast of Poland and the Baltic countries so their strikes can have more of an effect. After nearly 2 weeks of almost constant combat, the warships are almost out of missiles. With the inability to reload vertical launch systems at sea, the Supreme Allied Command makes the difficult decision to withdraw much of the fleet to refit back in Rota, Spain, to reload their VLS cells. With the bulk of the Navy withdrawing, the ground counteroffensive loses momentum. Though US and NATO arms are of much higher quality than Russian troops, the Russians do not have far to go from their depots in Belarus or Russia to replenish the horrendous losses they are suffering on the battlefield. However, the advantage is still with the US and NATO. Due to Russia expending most of its precision weapons in the first few weeks of the war, it's low on munitions that pose any real threat to Allied air power. As a result, US and NATO aircraft pound Russian positions day and night. Additionally, US Special Forces, including SEALs, Delta Force, Rangers, and Marine Raiders, alongside NATO partners, are wreaking havoc in Russian rear areas. Altogether, with the combined power of the Allied air campaign, the constant attacks on Russian rear areas, high casualties, and a breakdown in command and control, the invaders are forced to stop where they are and dig in. Week 3. By the third week, the massive Allied convoy of ships and personnel has arrived in Europe. To avoid clogging up any one port, the convoy broke up into smaller ones. These smaller detachments headed to ports in Norway, the Netherlands, Italy, and Greece. From there, they begin disembarking and head towards pre-positioned supply bases throughout Europe. For decades, the US and NATO forces have pre-positioned supplies for just this very reason. While the massive convoy brings along huge quantities of armored vehicles, ammunition, food, and other materials, these supply depots speed things along, since soldiers at these depots have been working since day one of the invasion to get gear prepped and ready for these troops. By the end of the week, this massive invasion force has assembled and been issued their equipment. Now numbering almost 900,000 troops, the US-NATO alliance has more than twice the numerical advantage on the Russians. While Russian troops holding the Suwalki Gap and parts of the Baltics might have on paper more tanks, armored vehicles and artillery pieces, most of their equipment does not work, has been destroyed, or if serviceable, is vastly inferior to Western equipment. The Russians are scrambling to consolidate their gains as the Allied army consolidates for a final push to retake NATO territory. According to Russian doctrine, they build 3 separate layers of defense. The first line of defense consists of deep mine belts with hastily dug slit trenches, manned by conscripts and prisoners. The Russians do not hope to hold there, but have these men sacrificed to slow down the US and NATO troops and inflict casualties. The second line of defense consists of their best troops, which include airborne, contract infantry soldiers, and professionally trained volunteer groups. Behind these positions is a third line consisting of fewer minefields and mostly a few hardpoints manned by units recovering from fighting or just newly arrived and waiting to be rotated into more forward positions. The fight ahead of the alliance is a tough one. Having to contend with masses of infantry, dug-in tanks, dense minefields, electronic jamming systems, drones, and mass artillery barrages, this fight is nothing like the US has ever seen in its complexity or scale since World War II. However, as they push on and advance slowly by blasting lanes through the minefields, overhead, US drones and air power pound Russian positions, while artillery units conduct counter-battery fire to eliminate Russian indirect fires. However, as this massive operation unfolds, another one is happening in the Mediterranean. Before disembarking in Greece and Italy, the Allied command directed portions of the task force to take over Tobruk. Russian submarines have been causing numerous casualties, and with the bulk of the navy reloading in port, there's little to stop them. Instead, the US and NATO forces launch an amphibious raid on Tobruk to render it inoperable. Resistance during the landings is minimal. While some Russians do stand and fight, their Libyan counterparts run for their lives. Once ashore, the Marines capture several Russian submarines still moored alongside. Several others have partially sunk due to preparatory fires from the Navy and Air Force. After the Marines blow up the captured Russian submarines, the Allied command makes the decision to occupy Tobruk for now. With the counteroffensive underway, the Allied armies will need large amounts of equipment and supplies. The sea lanes must be secured. Week 4. After several days of hard fighting and heavy casualties, US and NATO forces have broken through the first defensive lines and punched a few holes in the second. As Russia scrambles to send reinforcements to the Suwalki Gap, they divert resources from the Baltics. Sensing an opportunity, the NATO defenders launch their own vicious counterattack, which catches the Russians by surprise. But this is not the only counterattack this week. In Ukraine, the Ukrainian military has completely liberated Kherson Oblast and has started a new offensive in the east. With the bulk of the Russian forces transferred for the invasion of Eastern Europe, the DPR and LPR militias have been left largely to fend for themselves. Ukrainian forces easily punch through their lines and begin retaking territory not held since before 2014. With Allied armies counterattacking across every front, Putin knows the writing is on the wall. With his army unable to take any of the Baltic capitals, the loss of Kherson Oblast, the loss of Tobruk, the loss of his Baltic Sea fleet, and the imminent defeat on the battlefield in Poland, he knows there are not very many ways to spin this as a victory back home. However, Putin does not want to give in, and instead wants to double down his efforts. Though Putin has avoided general mobilization, he consults his trusted Siloviki about what to do now. They urge him to pull back what remains of Russian forces in the Baltics and Poland before they get cut off and destroyed. They try to convince him that they can spin this as having taught NATO a lesson, and maybe they can negotiate for what territory they still hold in Ukraine. But Putin is having none of it. Instead, he doubles down that he wants to declare general mobilization and commit the Russian people to a generation of war. That's when the Siloviki turn the tables on Putin. This group of roughly a dozen men carry out Putin's will in Russia and can control the military, police, and intelligence services. They unanimously threaten Putin that if he does not back down now, something might happen to him like what happened to Yevgeny Prigozhin. Sensing that he's lost control, Putin gives in and tells the Siloviki he will ask for a ceasefire. Putin calls an emergency meeting with Allied headquarters in Brussels. He wants a ceasefire in which Russian troops will maintain their current positions. However, the Allies want none of that. They tell him that unless Russia withdraws from all NATO territory back to the international border, they will continue the offensive until that goal is achieved. When he asks if he can keep the territory in Ukraine, the answer is a resounding no. The US directs Putin to withdraw all his forces back to the international borders before the 2014 annexation. If he does not, the war will continue with a US-led offensive that will force him to do so. Fearing that he would face more unrest at home due to general mobilization than losing illegally gained territory, Putin agrees. Though the war is now over, Putin assures his inner circle that he will not give up until he is dead. Whether he will actually live to see that day is now anyone's guess. But what do you think? Could the strategies outlined actually play out this way, or would there be unexpected twists and turns? A war between Russia and NATO might seem impossible. After all, NATO currently consists of 32 member countries, including the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and most of Europe. Collectively, NATO forces dwarf those of Russia, both in terms of quantity and quality. So how could a NATO-Russia war possibly come to pass? Well, as uncomfortable as it might be to consider, there are a few possibilities. For example, as very nearly came to pass in the 1980s, what if a NATO wargame was misinterpreted by Russian intelligence as cover for an assault on the motherland, leading to a preemptive strike? What if Russia decided to invade a smaller member state on its border, pushing the red lines and seeing if NATO, most importantly the US, responded? The history between Russia and NATO has long been tense. Despite a brief thaw after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, these tensions are back at a deep freeze. In fact, relations are arguably the worst they've been for half a century. Some have even said we're in a new Cold War. Join us as we delve into this hypothetical matchup and scenario, which aims to illustrate one key point: the US's involvement and leadership are critical. Without it, who knows what might happen. Hour 0. After years of planning, Putin's generals give the go-ahead. They want a much further divide between Russia's borders and NATO countries. Their target? Lithuania and the Baltic states. Taking Lithuania cuts Latvia and Estonia off from Europe, leaving them primed and ready for a further Russian advance. It's not just a territorial expanse, though. The Russians feel utterly betrayed by NATO and the US in particular. As the Soviet Union collapsed, NATO officials had indicated, but not in any legally binding manner, that NATO would avoid further eastward expansion, ensuring the new Russia didn't feel vulnerable. But it had reneged on that promise, and Russia was, and still is, deeply angry. Any potential trust was dead in the water as soon as any countries bordering Russia joined NATO, leading to the inevitable re-escalation of tension and the potential for a new cold or hot war. The ongoing war in Ukraine hasn't gone as planned. As of early mid-2024, Russian armed forces have taken a beating, with only around 1,750 tanks left in operational service, and that includes a few antiques. It has around 1,200 bombers, fighters, and attack aircraft left. But Russia must never be underestimated. Its infantry is even larger than in 2022 at the start of the Ukraine war, and despite significant equipment and vehicle losses, the production chain is ramping up. And close relations with allies like China and Iran mean more and more piling into the inventory every day. After months of testing and probing, including airspace and naval violations, as well as amassing troops on the border, Russia has seen little military response from Lithuania's NATO allies. Western leaders have verbally condemned Russia's thinly veiled threats, yet nobody has sent missiles, ships, jets, or reinforcements to their small ally. Okay, hour 0 rolls around. Judgment time. It's the middle of the night. The few hundred tanks Russia has left, removed from the war in Ukraine, are lined up on Lithuania's border. They fire up their engines and, escorted by 100,000 troops, mostly newly conscripted, approach the crossings. Simultaneously, GPS and radar jamming cripples Lithuanian navigation and communication systems, protecting the Russian soldiers and armaments from most missiles. Russia launches a barrage of thousands of sea and air-launched missiles, along with Iranian-built drones, first using its weaker, cheaper, and more disposable subsonic models. Lithuania has very few air defense units, and NATO hasn't finished ratifying the deal that will see the country host its more advanced launchers. The country's aerial defenses will be swiftly overwhelmed, at which point the supersonic and hypersonic arsenal will come into play. Simultaneously, Russia launches its spare 4th and 5th generation fighter jets, including older Sukhoi 27s and MiG-29s, as well as their newer counterparts, the Su-30, Su-35s, and a couple of brand new Su-57s. The Lithuanian Air Force, the LTAF, has no chance. No matter how excellent their training is, the numbers are overwhelming. Their 6 or so active aircraft are mostly helicopters and transport planes, no match for modern multi-purpose jets. Although the long-range radar stations in the east of the country see the Russians coming a mile off, there's nothing they can do. The jets are on top of them almost immediately, heading straight for the LTAF airbase in Šiauliai. Russia has 2 primary goals and 2 secondary objectives. First, it seeks to take Vilnius, the Lithuanian capital, near its border, before NATO can respond. Second, it will aim to seize land between Belarus and Poland, slowing NATO land defenses. Then, if it can conquer all 3 Baltic states without triggering nuclear war, it will have significant access to the Baltic and a much greater barrier between itself and NATO advances. And finally, even if it all comes to naught, Putin will learn an awful lot about how NATO conducts war. Lithuania's intelligence division, the VSD, has expected this move for some time. After all, why else would an openly threatening country line its troops up on the border? However, Lithuania's pleas for assistance to NATO allies have previously been swept under the rug. Nobody else believed Russia would start another war, especially considering its ongoing losses in Ukraine. How wrong they were. Hour 1. The attack has been strategically timed. Almost all NATO leaders around the world are asleep or preparing for bed. Only the American president and Canadian prime minister are still awake, but they're enjoying rare peaceful evenings with their families. But intelligence operatives are wide awake. All around the world, NATO leaders are urgently roused from their slumber and immediately summoned to high-security meetings. They're informed of Russia's invasion. The British Prime Minister, French President, and German Chancellor sleepily try to grasp the severity of the situation. At the same time, their 2 North American counterparts hold their heads in their hands. The world is on the brink of war, and Article 5 of the NATO agreement forces their retaliation, along with 26 other countries, and of course, Lithuania itself. But legal obligations aside, is an aggressive retaliation a plausible response? Will it save lives? Or most crucially of all, will it risk triggering an all-out nuclear war, mutually assured destruction of all major powers, and millions of unnecessary casualties? The NATO Response Force, the NRF, and its 40,000 troops are primed and ready to respond. They've been training for this and know that NATO can quickly mobilize a further 300,000 soldiers, with millions more prepared to be called up. But it needs the go-ahead. It can't act without authorization from the top. And the NATO leaders have a dilemma. NATO was implemented to deter Soviet expansion and aggression, seeking to prevent conflict. Now that war has started anyway, they face an unprecedented situation. How should they respond? Hour 2. NATO negotiators immediately try to open communication channels with the Kremlin. They're deeply concerned about the risk of worldwide nuclear war and outright destruction, but nobody answers. And because nobody answers, NATO leaders are at a loss for what to do. In fact, in Russia, Putin and his generals are purposefully ignoring the ringing red hotline, waiting to see how the West will respond. What move will they make? Until such time, they'll continue with the invasion as planned. Meanwhile, as dawn approaches, odd things start happening in industries throughout Lithuania and its Baltic state neighbors Estonia and Latvia. Breakers in power substations around the countries start mysteriously flipping off, bank networks go offline, port gates stop working, and strange messages appear on the phones of government officials and contractors. Before long, the vast majority of computers display nothing more than a black screen and a ransom message demanding Bitcoin payment. On the surface, it looks like an independent extortionist hacking group, but the strategic timing leaves few in doubt. Russia's elite hackers, such as the elusive GRU group known as Sandworm, are almost certainly behind the carnage. As Lithuanians wake up in a war, they find their heating and air conditioning systems offline. No matter, they've survived far more than the relatively mild discomfort caused by a spring attack on infrastructure like this, but they soon find it's far more than their systems. Most of the power remains out, preventing streetlights from working, electric cars from charging, and shops from opening. Even more dangerously, software helping the armed forces direct their personnel and organize strategic moves is utterly destroyed, along with all its backups. Its leaders and soldiers are resilient though, and they turn to less conventional methods to facilitate communication. These include WhatsApp communications through satellite Wi-Fi and even runners carrying notes to and fro. Hour 3. Lithuanian forces continue to engage the Russian onslaught, but there's very little they can do without NATO support. Brave soldiers take out Russians at a ratio of more than 5-1. Still, the relentless wave of humans and machinery just keeps coming. Eventually, the self-sacrificial defenders are forced to fall back or risk being overwhelmed and wiped out. Where are its allies? Where is NATO? NATO is deliberating. European leaders are by now wide awake and beginning to plan countermeasures. Despite the encroaching night, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau in North America down strong coffees and continue to work. Here's the broader situation. Britain and France, 2 of the strongest European powers, have nuclear weapons of their own. Other countries, including Germany, Italy, and Belgium, have American nukes stationed within their borders. They're all poised and ready to fire them if necessary, but doing so would have catastrophic consequences. Despite Russia's significant losses of personnel and equipment in Ukraine and now Lithuania, it still maintains the largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world, with 5,580 warheads as of 2024. Of these, 1,710 are deployed and ready to be launched on a missile or loaded onto a bomber at a moment's notice. The world's other nuclear superpower, the US, held 3,708 as of 2023, with 1,419 deployed. In contrast, the world's other nuclear powers hold relatively meager numbers. Again, in 2023, China had 410, the UK had 225, France held 290, Pakistan had 170, India 164, Israel 90, and North Korea about 30. While these numbers may pale in comparison, especially considering that most are likely not actively deployed, note that modern nuclear weapons are often 50 to 100 times more powerful than those dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. If just one hits its intended target, the damage would be unfathomable, too great for the human brain to even comprehend. That's why NATO is carefully considering its next move. Russia is unpredictable right now, testing the waters and seeing what it can get away with. It's looking for a fight, but it doesn't have a death wish. NATO leaders, and most importantly the US, must choose their play carefully. The discussions are tense and drag on. All the while, Lithuanian soldiers are being pushed further and further back, with ground forces entering the outskirts of Vilnius. The tragic deaths are mounting. Hour 4. NATO boffins have been working away at the Russian cyber attack, isolating and reverse engineering the malware. Whoever is behind it is a genius. The destructive code has been a ticking time bomb, isolating unknown weaknesses in Windows operating systems and using these to spread through local networks. At the invasion's preset date, which must have been in the minds of Russian military planners for months, the malware code ran, wiping all the data in its path. While the Baltic states aren't the only ones affected, the bulk of the operational damage is concentrated in these areas. With NATO's help, the Lithuanians bring some power systems back online. It was a temporary handicap, but one which was extremely costly. As Lithuanian forces fall back, their communication systems come back online. This, combined with the never-say-die attitude of its armed forces, turned the battle towards guerrilla tactics. This begins to have a devastating morale impact on Russian troops, who are seeing their comrades killed in huge numbers all around them. Like the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians use their knowledge of the terrain and their force of mind to slow the Russian advance, proving particularly effective against the old and cumbersome tanks. Meanwhile, relatively safe in their comfortable meeting places throughout Europe and North America, the US finally decides what to do. Its fellow member states agree and turn to the job at hand with grim determination. NATO will reinforce Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia with troops, tanks, aircraft, ships, submarines, missiles, and missile defense systems. The overwhelming number and the quality of the individual units and troops should prove more than a match for Russia. However, NATO allocates the US to contact the Russians, explaining in clear terms that nuclear weapons are not on the table. Not yet, anyway. With their forces already gathered and ready, NATO sends supplies, armaments, and response force troops to the Baltic states. Countries begin mobilizing their standing armies and calling volunteers to enlist. The European navies, notably Britain and France, aren't what they once were. They must wait for reinforcements from the Italians, while the far more extensive American fleet begins the journey to join them. In the meantime, the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier, the final iteration of the nuclear-powered Nimitz-class vessels with its FA-18 Super Hornets and E-2 Hawkeyes, is already in the area, despite usually being part of Carrier Strike Group 5 operating in the Indo-Pacific. NATO can respond quickly. However, one question remains: will they reach the Lithuanians in time? Day 2. The fighting rages on all day before nighttime brings a brief reprieve for most. Special forces operations from Lithuania, NATO, and Russia continue to penetrate across the lines in both directions, springing devastating surprise attacks and assassinations, but the battle lines, just outside Vilnius, hold relatively steady. It's looking good for Lithuania. Despite fierce resistance, the Russian forces simply keep on coming. Although the NATO alliance is on the way, there's little it can do to keep the onslaught at bay. Its leaders consult what to do. They know that every second the fighting continues, more men and women will die. But with ships, aircraft, and vehicles steamrolling in to reinforce them, they just need to hold out a bit longer. The decision is made that the sacrifice of the country's brave soldiers is worth it. If Russia takes the capital, they might never see independence again. By the second day, most power companies are back online, their systems restored from obscure backups. There are still a few glitches and areas where administrators struggle to bring industries back from cyber destruction, but still, things look far more positive than the previous day. Buildings in Vilnius are being flattened, with civilian deaths mounting. Artillery and missile fire takes down critical infrastructure, including power stations, transformers, and even hospitals. The situation is dire. There's no support from the ground or the air. The tiny LTAF has been destroyed before it even left the asphalt. Meanwhile, NATO introduces even more official sanctions on Russia, hitting its economy hard. Without the vital trade, Russia notices the first signs of struggles. However, plenty more countries outside of NATO rely on Russian imports and exports, notably China, Iran, Belarus, and North Korea. Although their trade is significantly reduced and the stock markets take a hammering, Russian forces show no signs of slowing down. The Lithuanian armed forces are growing tired as the day draws to a close. Russian armaments continue to pour over the border in droves, missiles raining down, with the local missile defense systems completely overwhelmed. Civilian deaths and infrastructure damage are rising exponentially. But as evening comes, the first signs of hope arrive. Fifth-generation jets land in neighboring Poland, ready to launch devastating counterattacks. Vehicle-borne missile launchers used for attack and defense arrive in neighboring countries and Lithuania. These immediately kick into action, significantly reducing the damage from the air and providing Russian jets and bombers with a substantially more complex adversary. Day 3. Throughout all this time, Russia has had a gaping hole, the Baltic Sea. With all of Scandinavia now in NATO, there are plenty of places from which Lithuania can be reinforced, and sea access to the country can be maintained. Russia's Baltic Sea fleet consists of only one traditional old Soviet submarine, Dimitrov. In fact, it's one of the oldest submarines in the entire Russian Navy. Despite about 2 frigates, 27 corvettes, and a few landing craft, the Baltic Sea fleet is hopelessly outdated and focused more on intelligence and troop movement than military might. Its one destroyer, the Sovremeny-class Nastoychevi, has been in repair since 2019. The Baltic Fleet simply hasn't been the priority next to, for example, the Black Sea Fleet or the Northern Fleet in the Arctic. At the start of the third day of the war, Russia contacts NATO. The combined fleets have reached distances at which they can engage. Heavy artillery begins raining down on Russian positions, and Russian naval bases in Kaliningrad are immediately overwhelmed. NATO naval forces are simply far greater in numbers and firepower. And it isn't just at sea that NATO begins to take the advantage, supporting its small member state. Missile launchers line up, keeping a significant distance from each other to ensure safety in isolation. Russian jets now have a considerable problem avoiding missiles from the advanced Patriot missile defense systems. Almost all Russian missiles are now being intercepted, and Lithuania and NATO begin counterstrikes on Russian-held positions and reinforcement points. NATO jets join in, pounding targets relentlessly. Russia's air defense systems are put to work, but as time passes, NATO missiles are being constantly resupplied, and fifth-generation fighters with enhanced missile evasion capabilities keep coming. Russia, on the other hand, has a limited supply of both missiles and jets, and it can't afford to significantly reduce its stock or needlessly expend its hypersonic missiles or fifth-generation fighters in case of a more impactful future conflict. It's time to talk. Negotiations begin. But in the meantime, the fighting continues. Putin is determined to learn as much about his enemy as he can. Likewise, NATO troops fight with renewed resolve for a free Lithuania. Although most NATO leaders are now confident in victory, they aren't sure yet when that will come around, nor the total cost of the war once arms are laid down. Week 2. As the war drags into its second week, the tide decisively turns in NATO's favor. Superior numbers and superior quality in those numbers mean that NATO armies have a massive advantage. F-35C aircraft from aircraft carriers dominate Russian-held positions, backed up by Europe's favored Eurofighter Typhoons. With footholds and FOBs established throughout Poland, Estonia, and Latvia, they pound Russian forces from the north and south, reinforcing in swarms. Naval bases in Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark allow Allied ships to repeatedly dock, resupply, and come back at the trapped Russian forces, decimating their Baltic Sea fleet and honing in on Kaliningrad, Russia's main seaport. With the Danes controlling access to the Baltic Sea from the north, Russia has virtually no chance of breaking out. Their only hope is to surrender or fight alongside attacks on harbors or logistics chains. Fortunately for Russia, cyber attacks are its specialty. Government hackers launch a barrage of distributed denial of service and malware probes toward the Scandinavian-owned NATO ports. They have some initial success, with dock workers and sailors becoming confused and losing access to schedules and cargo information. This leads to long lines of ships stretching out into the sea, and these NATO vessels are vulnerable to attack. Russian missiles, jets, and their naval fleet turn to attack the ships and succeed in doing critical damage to a couple, but they're overwhelmed and forced to retreat by the hastily assembled escort warships. Cyber attacks can bring an immense temporary advantage. However, cybersecurity experts usually find a way to restore backed-up data or work around the malware within a few days, sometimes a few hours. In this case, NATO cybersecurity experts have the port systems back online and up to date in a few hours. It takes only a couple of days for the dock workers working overtime to get back on track. As Russia is pushed further and further back, things appear increasingly gloomy. Month 2. Russia begins to consolidate its forces. Putin knows he's not going to make any further progress against NATO and rallies all his troops back across the Russian border. But there's one last move in the book, and one that shakes Biden, Sunak, Scholz, Macron, Trudeau, and the rest of the NATO leaders to their core. Intelligence suggests that nuclear weapons are being prepped for launch in Kaliningrad and South Belarus. With no other option, NATO quickly decides it must act, preparing nuclear warhead-tipped Tomahawk missiles. Although Russia still has plenty of missiles, the invasion of Lithuania was never intended as a territorial expansion or a declaration of war on the rest of NATO. Russian leaders would never take such outrageous action, not without good reason to believe in their success at least. No, instead, the Lithuanian invasion was always very likely to fail. It was always going to end up as a test, a sort of tragic live-fire exercise, a test of Russia's capabilities, an examination of how NATO would respond. Would nuclear weapons be on the table? Would the states get involved? Or would it refuse to risk escalating the conflict further? Russia hasn't gained any military ground or established any footholds. It will soon inevitably be forced to retreat, and yet that's what Putin and his leaders always expected would happen. In fact, they're fascinated by how the events have played out. NATO countries were far more willing to reinforce Lithuania than many in the war cabinet had imagined. Equally, the initial response from NATO was fraught with confusion, hesitation, and a hint of panic. Even as NATO missiles pound down, decimating their forces, Russia feels a gleam of satisfaction. It's learned a lot. It doesn't take long for the surrender and peace agreement to be reached, in which Russia promises never to invade again and pay for the damages sustained to Lithuania and the NATO forces. Putin and his government smile. They lost the battle, decidedly, but next time, things might be different. What do you think a war between NATO and Russia would look like? Who would come out on top and why? China's President Xi Jinping has spent years preparing for what he's about to do. For him and much of China, it all began with Japan's claim over the Senkaku Islands in January 1895. These uninhabited islands to the west of Okinawa had long been unclaimed territory, with Japan recognizing this and going through the proper legal channels of the day to claim them. That control hasn't wavered much since. Granted, Japan temporarily placed the islands under US administration following World War II, but they came back to Japan following the 1972 Okinawa Reversion Agreement. China didn't care about these islands for the longest time. That is until the 1970s and the discovery of oil in the East China Sea. Currently, the US Energy Information Administration claims that there are 200 million barrels of proven reserves near the Senkaku Islands, with China believing the actual resources available may be as many as 160 billion barrels. China wants that oil. To get it, China will need to control the Senkaku Islands. That's why Xi has spent the past few years trying to intimidate the Japanese government into handing them over by sailing Chinese military ships within Japanese territorial waters. The gambit hasn't worked. All Xi has achieved is raising the tensions between China and Japan. China's president doesn't care. He's done with gently prodding Japan with territorial incursions. Now he's ready to fight, not only over the Senkaku Islands, but for full control of both the South and East China Seas, so he can finally realize his ambition of making China the only major power broker in the Indo-Pacific. To do that, Xi decides he needs to finally do what China has historically struggled to do. He needs to put to rest China's century of humiliation in which Japan played such a huge role. Xi decides that China must declare war on Japan to take full control of the Indo-Pacific. Hour 1. Xi knows that any battle with Japan must be conducted at sea. The two countries are separated by the East China Sea, which will serve as the main battleground in what Xi hopes will be a quick naval victory. He knows that China has an advantage in terms of pure numbers. China's navy is the second largest in the world with 730 assets compared to Japan's 155. Xi knows he has more submarines, 61 to Japan's 23, as well as 13 more destroyers, 38 more frigates, and 66 more corvettes. Then there's his ace in the hole, a pair of aircraft carriers that will enable him to bring some of China's 1,207 fighter aircraft into the battle. Those carriers won't be part of the initial attack. Instead, Xi takes a sly approach. Sending out several small naval patrols, each containing a trio of warships along with smaller patrol vessels, he allows his ships to encroach on Japanese territory. The key here is to make it look like China is just doing what it's done for the last several years. He already has ships near the Senkaku Islands. They'd been there for 158 consecutive days as of May 31st, and they haven't moved in a month or so since. Xi has also established a pattern of intrusions that cause Japan to send out its own ships to watch and, in some cases, escort China's ships out of Japanese territory. He's going to use that response to his advantage. 8 patrols have been sent out simultaneously, each led by a Type 055 destroyer and supported by smaller warships, essentially allowing China to create a barricade around Japan. As expected, Japan sends out warships and maritime aircraft of its own to monitor the Chinese incursions, as it's done so many times in the past. This time, however, it's different. Xi waits for his ships to get into position before giving the order: fire. The Type 055 cruisers cause the most damage. Each is a guided missile cruiser, capable of displacing 13,000 tons at full load. The ships are just over 590 feet long, making them some of the largest warships in China's arsenal, and can travel at speeds of up to 30 knots. However, it's their weapon loadouts that have made them the choice for these initial strikes. Each is equipped with a 112-cell vertical launching system that's capable of firing a range of missiles. Key among these is China's HHQ-9 surface-to-air missile. They take out the Japanese aircraft sent in response to China's incursions, with more being available on each ship to attack any other fighters Japan will send out. To handle the ships, those same vertical launchers can be loaded with YJ-18 anti-ship and land attack missiles, with CY-5 missile-launched anti-submarine torpedoes also available if China detects any Japanese submarines in the area. Add an HHQ-10 close-in air defense missile system, stocked with 24 missiles for any aircraft that manages to escape the initial HHQ-9 barrages, as well as a 130mm naval gun and a Type 730 HPJ-11 close-in weapon system, and the Type 055 is a dangerous enemy. Each of these Type 055s is backed by several smaller ships, which pile on the pressure during the initial assault. However, Xi's greatest advantage during this first hour of the war is the element of surprise. Though Japan routinely sends out ships to shadow the Chinese ships that encroach on its territory, they don't anticipate an attack. Missiles are landing on hulls and taking out aircraft before Japan even has a chance to react. By the end of the initial strike, China has dealt a major blow to Japan's navy. Japan's typical response to China's incursions is to send out an Abukuma-class destroyer escort, a Sugashima-class minesweeper, and both P-1 and P-3C maritime patrol aircraft. 2 ships and 2 aircraft per Chinese incursion add up to Japan losing 16 ships and 16 of its planes. Granted, it manages to sink a handful of China's smaller warships as it responds to the attack, but China has won the initial battle. Japan is scrambling to formulate a stronger response. Hour 2. Chaos reigns in Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force, or JMSDF. The country's Minister of Defense, Minoru Kihara, finds himself being bounced from pillar to post as he tries to coordinate a response to the initial attack. Orders are given for ships to dispatch from all of Japan's naval bases. The 43rd Mine Warfare Force leaves Sasebo Naval Base, with its goal being to escort Japan's fleet and aviation groups. Units from Japan's Fleet Escort Force, Fleet Submarine Force, and Mine Warfare Force are dispatched from the Kura Naval Base. The Self-Defense Fleet and Maizuru District Force dispatched from Maizuru Naval Base, and from the Ominato Naval Base come the Ominato District Force, a Fleet Escort Force, and the Ominato Coastal Safety Force. An impressive response. However, Kihara knows that it won't be enough. China's navy outnumbers Japan's by nearly 5-1, and reports are already coming in that the initial Chinese force is being supplemented by new ships. China is looking to fill the East China Sea with vessels to pen Japan as close to its own coast as possible, forcing Japan's ships into a situation in which they have little room to maneuver. Less room means fewer chances of avoiding the missile barrages that start raining down on Japan's ships. Japan is going to need help. Kihara encourages Fumio Kishida, Japan's Prime Minister, to contact President Joe Biden and ask for help. Hour 3. Kishida's call doesn't come as a surprise to Biden. The United States has 120 military bases in Japan, in which it has stationed 53,246 troops, so Biden knew of the attack the moment it happened. He also knows that Kishida is going to ask, Japan's Prime Minister needs the United States to come to its aid. The US has an obligation to do so to an extent. It signed a defense cooperation agreement with Japan that says the US Navy and Japan's self-defense forces will cooperate in any instance where an enemy launches a ballistic missile attack on Japan. That's already happened. Several of the missiles the Type 055s and their support ships fired fall under the ballistic category. However, Biden also knows that the cooperative agreements provide him with some breathing space. The US is only obligated to provide Japan with any intelligence necessary for its counterattack, with the choice of involving American forces in that counterattack being considered as the US deems necessary. In other words, Biden doesn't have to use the US military to defend Japan. At the same time, he understands the consequences if Japan falls. The East China Sea will fall under China's control, likely to be quickly followed by the South China Sea. And if Xi is willing to show such aggression to one of the main military powers in the Indo-Pacific, what's to stop him from attacking South Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, or any of the other countries that dispute China's claims in the South China Sea? And if China controls both the East and South China Seas, it also controls massive oil reserves and transit through the region. Biden can't allow that to happen. Still, he tells Kishida that he needs to take time to formulate a US response. After all, this is a war with China, one of the world's most powerful countries. He wants to wait a day or two to decide whether the US is ready to enter what will become a global war. Day 2. Xi is happy with how his strategy has played out so far. He anticipated Japan sending out almost its entire navy to respond to China's attack, with his decision to have a larger fleet ready to sail to Japan to box those ships in proving a masterstroke. Now the two navies are engaged in a tit-for-tat battle in which they're firing missiles and sinking each other's ships. Xi knows that he has more ships available, meaning that he will eventually win that battle. But he can't become complacent. The threat of the United States entering the conflict is clear in his mind. He knows about Japan's defensive agreements with the US, and he's a little surprised to see that America hasn't sent out ships of its own yet. All the better for Xi. He has a plan that he hopes will severely hinder what he sees as the inevitable US involvement in this operation. Day 3. Kishida and Kihara are growing more frustrated. They expected the United States to immediately approve the sending of ships and aircraft it had stationed in Japan into the Indo-Pacific theater to support the Maritime Self-Defense Force. That hasn't happened yet. Instead, they both watched as the US, along with the rest of the Western world, has condemned the attack without getting directly involved. Does America not understand what the loss of Japan would mean for its influence in the Indo-Pacific? Back in the United States, Biden is still figuring out exactly how the US will respond. He's already made up his mind that the US needs to get involved, with the sticking point being the measure of that involvement. He could send out the entire 7th Fleet. At any given time, that fleet has between 50 and 70 ships and submarines stationed in Japan and 150 aircraft. Along with the 27,000 sailors and US Marines stationed with the fleet, those ships and planes could make a difference. The problem is they wouldn't be enough to repel the Chinese invasion alone. At best, the addition of these ships and planes would prop the JMSDF up to around 200 ships and around 400 aircraft. China still has a huge number advantage. To really stand a chance, the US will need to send the full force of its navy. That will take time, at least 2 weeks for ships stationed in the United States to sail the Pacific and reach Japan. Biden continues to deliberate. Day 10. China's navy is slowly wearing down Japan's after boxing them in. The JMSDF has lost over a quarter of its ships and around 50 aircraft. Everything it throws at China is returned in kind, with the People's Liberation Army Navy seeming to have a ship ready to replace any that the JMSDF sinks. The JMSDF doesn't have that luxury, and Xi knows it. Now it's time to finally enact the second part of his plan. He knows that Biden, for all his hemming and hawing, is going to decide to send the US Navy into the East China Sea. Some of that navy is on its way. The USS George H.W. Bush is already en route, flanked by around a dozen destroyers and various ships, but they're still in the middle of the Pacific. More worrying for China is the USS Ronald Reagan, which is part of the 7th Fleet and would allow the US to bring its fighters into the battle. Thankfully, that ship hasn't been deployed into the East China Sea yet. None of America's ships stationed in Japan are involved in the conflict. Biden is clearly trying to beef up his forces in the Indo-Pacific before America joins the fight. Xi decides a preemptive strike is needed. For that, he'll use China's 2 aircraft carriers, the Liaoning and the Shandong. Unfortunately for Xi, his 3rd carrier, the Fujian, is estimated to enter service in 2025. Never mind, as the Liaoning and Shandong should be enough for what comes next. Combined, the 2 carriers are home to 76 aircraft, including the Shenyang J-15, Changhe Z-18, and Harbin Z-9. The latter 2 are helicopters, so they won't be useful for China's next strike. However, the J-15 will be. Derided by some as a near-carbon copy of Russia's Su-33, the J-15 is a multi-role fighter. It's capable of carrying anti-ship, air-to-air, and air-to-surface missiles, along with precision-guided bombs. It's the latter two that will prove crucial in China's next attack. Xi orders his carriers to sit behind the barricade his ships have created around Japan, offering them protection against Japanese missiles and aircraft. From here, he orders the J-15s to take flight. Their target? America and Japan's joint naval base in Yokosuka, the current home of the USS Ronald Reagan. Xi's J-15s will fly over, launching their missiles and dropping their bombs to destroy as much of the base as possible. The USS Ronald Reagan will be a key target, as removing it from the picture means the US loses some of its ability to deploy fighters from within the East China Sea. Instead, they'll be limited to their naval and air force bases in Japan, allowing China to continually bombard those static bases as the US attempts to respond. The next few days are marked by these aerial base assaults. The USS Ronald Reagan is taken out of commission, along with dozens of the planes and ships that make up the 7th Fleet. China didn't manage to destroy everything, of course, with the 7th Fleet joining the JMSDF in the East China Sea to bolster Japan's defenses in response to the base attacks. But that works fine for Xi. His preemptive strike has already dented the strength of a naval force that wasn't powerful enough to take on the entire Chinese Navy, even when combined with the JMSDF. It's only a matter of time before Japan's defenses crumble, and China is able to establish a clear waterborne path that would allow it to start landing soldiers on the Japanese mainland. Day 11. Kishida has spent most of the day communicating with Biden and US military commanders. Though frustrated that it took the United States being attacked before it directly entered the fighting, he's at least happy to know that America's remaining ships in the Indo-Pacific have joined the JMSDF. He also knows that more are coming, with the initial fleet sent from the United States being followed by several more units in the wake of the attack. Japan's goal from this point forth is to survive long enough for a larger contingent of the US Navy to arrive. Sadly, America's NATO allies won't be joining the fight, though they're bound by Article 5 of the NATO Charter to fight alongside the US if America is ever attacked on its own soil. The attacks by China on America's bases in Japan don't count. Those bases aren't considered to be US soil, so they don't count as a trigger for Article 5. Still, there's other good news. Beyond the 7th Fleet joining with the JMSDF, Japan has also been able to take advantage of the trilateral defense agreement it has with the US and South Korea. It just so happens that the USS Theodore Roosevelt, another of America's aircraft carriers, had arrived in South Korea just days before Xi launched his initial attack. Losing the USS Ronald Reagan was a devastating blow. But in the USS Theodore Roosevelt, Japan gets access to another aircraft carrier to supplement the aerial forces it's sending into the battle from its mainland. Better yet, that aircraft carrier is sailing in from the north of the East China Sea, which will force the PLAN to split its attention between Japan and a separate fleet coming from South Korea. With more than 60 fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters on board, it doesn't quite level the playing field alone. But with Japan's air force still flying into the battle from land, along with the US involving the 100 or so planes it had left following China's initial strike, the lucky appearance of the USS Theodore Roosevelt at least gives the PLAN more issues to think about. Then there's Japan's own ace in the hole, the South Korean Navy. Though Japan and South Korea have a tense history of their own, marked by the Japanese occupation of Korea in the early 20th century, they are both part of the Trilateral Defense Agreement signed with the United States. And while that agreement doesn't obligate South Korea to defend Japan from an attack, the country's president, Yoon Suk-yeol, has already reached the same realization that Biden reached just days before. He can't allow China to win the battle in the East China Sea. Doing so would likely put South Korea in the firing line next. And worse yet, China may ally with North Korea upon turning its attentions to South Korea. Even if that doesn't happen, the loss of Japan means the reduction of US influence and, by extension, South Korean influence in the Indo-Pacific. So Yoon Suk-yeol agrees that South Korea should join the fight. With that agreement comes further supplementation of the JMSDF in the East China Sea. South Korea has 200 naval assets, including 13 destroyers, 17 frigates, 22 submarines, and 5 corvettes. It also has an impressive air force that boasts 1,261 craft, with its proximity to the East China Sea meaning that it will be able to launch strikes against the Chinese Navy from the north as the combined Japanese and US forces fight from the east. Japan is starting to turn the tide. Though it's still fighting to a stalemate and losing ships by the day, it's now on the verge of surrounding China's Navy with the help of the US and South Korea. Day 15. President Xi is furious. He hadn't anticipated the arrival of the USS Theodore Roosevelt in the East China Sea, and he believed that South Korea would stay out of the fighting. Why wouldn't it? For all of its recent cooperation with Japan, South Korea understands what it means to be subjugated to the country's former imperialism. He had hoped to quickly defeat Japan before moving on to negotiate with South Korea from a position of power. That won't happen anymore. Even worse, China's naval power is now almost being matched in the East China Sea. Two of the biggest flaws in the PLAN are being exposed. First, for as large as the PLAN is in terms of its assets, the amount of power those assets bring to the table isn't as high as China would like. Over 150 of its 730 ships are small patrol vessels that are unsuited for a naval war, meaning China has been revealed to not be quite as powerful as first believed. That wouldn't have been a problem if Japan was fighting alone. But with the US and South Korea joining the fray, that lack of power may start to tell. Second, mistakes are starting to creep in. That's a result of a combination of inadequate training and the lack of direct combat experience within the PLAN. China hasn't been at war since 1979 and certainly hasn't had the chance to test its might since its military underwent its great modernization. Again, the same is true of Japan, but with the experience of the US to back it, Japan is putting up a much stronger fight than anticipated. The training issue is even more worrying. Several of Xi's ship captains and vice captains hadn't completed their training prior to him starting the war with Japan, including the vice captain of one corvette, who is still months away from taking his test. There's a talent shortage in the PLAN, particularly relating to the Navy's more high-tech roles. That's manifesting in PLAN's ships struggling to properly coordinate attacks and, in some cases, the ships themselves failing to perform due to inadequate maintenance. China's numbers advantage is slowly declining as a result, and the situation is only going to get worse for Xi. More ships from the US are coming in. Day 20. Following a long voyage via the Pacific Ocean, the USS George H.W. Bush arrives in Japan, alongside a contingent of American destroyers and frigates. They stop briefly at Naval Base Okinawa before sailing south of Japan. That initial fleet's job will be twofold: attack China's navy in the East China Sea from the south, while simultaneously creating a barrier between the East and South China Seas to hinder China's attempts to send more of its ships into battle. China's own tactic is being used against it, as the arrival of the USS George H.W. Bush and the following fleet allows Japan to box the PLAN in to the East China Sea. More ships are coming from the Pacific, meaning the barricade will only get stronger. And there's more bad news for China. The US Navy's Fifth Fleet is also on the way. Though the fleet is normally responsible for conducting operations within the 2.5 million square miles of water that includes the Arabian Gulf, Gulf of Oman, Arabian Sea, and the Red Sea, along with some parts of the Indian Ocean, Biden has decided to employ it in the fight against China to create a naval pincer attack. The fleet, which has 7 task forces that include unmanned underwater vehicles, unmanned surface vehicles, and unmanned aerial vehicles, is en route now, just south of India, and will soon arrive in the South China Sea. When it arrives, China will see the PLAN split in two, with each part facing battles on multiple fronts. In the East China Sea, Japan and the US are attacking from the east, South Korea and the US come in from the north, and the recently arrived Pacific Fleet will attack from the south. The ships that remain in the South China Sea also face attacks from the north and from the Pacific Fleet, along with strikes from the US Fifth Fleet to the south. Day 30. President Xi is left to think about the tactical blunders he made as he finds his navy completely boxed in. Close to the full force of the US Navy has been combined with Japan, with South Korea's participation in the fight being unexpected. He expected American involvement, he just didn't expect it to this extent. The arrival of the Fifth Fleet was the final blow to his ambitions. Xi had assumed the US would leave that fleet in the Red Sea, both to continue combating the Houthis and because he thought that India would raise objections to having that fleet sail around the south of its country to join the fight in the South China Sea. But Xi didn't reckon for the US feeling capable of leaving the Red Sea because it wasn't fighting there alone. It had the help of a coalition of more than 20 countries that could cover for it whilst its ships were gone. The Red Sea was in safe hands. As for India, Xi could only look back at several tactical blunders he'd made before attacking Japan. Inviting the likes of Iran and Egypt into the BRICS economic partnership hadn't helped. By doing so, China and Russia had combined to minimize India's influence in the group, leaving the country feeling marginalized inside an organization that was supposed to help it prosper. Then there were the border disputes along the line of actual control. Xi's troops had clashed with India's on several occasions over the last few years, with tensions still rising along that border. Still, he thought offering tacit approval for the US Navy to sail through the Indian Ocean was beyond India. Xi was wrong. India has stayed neutral and hasn't offered support to either side, but it also raised no objections when the Fifth Fleet began its voyage. Now the Fifth Fleet was in the South China Sea, with more ships arriving via the Pacific daily. They joined Japan to pen China's ever-weakening navy in, with Xi only able to watch as his tactics were used against him. China is losing ships. Chief among them is the Liaoning, one of China's aircraft carriers. That loss forced Xi to withdraw the Shandong for fear of losing it too, meaning China's navy no longer has the air support Xi would like to provide. Sure, aircraft can still take off from the Chinese mainland, but their range is limited, and the JMSDF seems content to sit at the far reaches of that range while working alongside the US and South Korea to pick China's ships off vessel by vessel. Xi's navy has nowhere to go. Neither does Xi. His attempted naval invasion of Japan has failed not because China's navy is weaker than Japan's, it is or was far stronger. Instead, it failed because Japan has smartly built alliances with countries that have an interest in ensuring that China doesn't become a more powerful influence in the Indo-Pacific. Xi is left to rue the fact that he has essentially lost a war to the United States and South Korea, as well as to Japan, and without the stomach for declaring a full-blown war against the US, he's forced to back down. Japan is victorious, but it's something of a Pyrrhic victory. The JMSDF will need to rebuild after losing dozens of ships as it held the line and waited for reinforcements. Bases will need to be rebuilt and armaments replenished. Still, Japan's ties with South Korea are stronger than they've ever been, with their ties with the US being reinforced by the support provided to the JMSDF. If China ever attacks again, Japan will be ready. This is just one of many interpretations of what might happen if the Chinese and Japanese navies went to war. Perhaps the United States and South Korea never get involved, or China might be able to call on its own allies, such as North Korea, in the fight. So, what do you think? Would China defeat Japan in a naval battle, or would something similar to the scenario we've discussed played out? Imagine a scenario where the Middle East's precarious peace shatters in an instant. At the heart of the crisis, a bold Iranian strike against Israel, a direct response to an April assault on Tehran's consular interests in Damascus. The retaliatory move isn't just about regional dynamics, it's about showing strength when pushed to the brink. As missiles arc over the sky, tracing paths of defiance and despair, the first hour of this conflict will set the tone for what would become one of the most consequential confrontations in modern history. Hour 1. Hundreds of missiles and drones will be sent from Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen in a direct military attack on the Jewish state. But of the dozens of cruise missiles launched by Iran and its proxies, most will be intercepted by Israeli fighter jets or shot down by one of Israel's high-tech air defense systems, with only a handful of the 100-plus ballistic missiles that took flight actually falling inside Israel's borders. This initial barrage from Iran, lasting 4 or 5 hours, will cause minimal damage to mostly military targets. At the onset of this attack, the US military will also leap to Israel's defense, shooting down dozens of missiles and drones, primarily utilizing its nearby Navy destroyers like the USS Carney and USS Arleigh Burke, which were both stationed nearby in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. The US Air Force's 494th Fighter Squadron, headquartered in Britain, and its 335th Fighter Squadron out of Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina, will also get in on the action, sending 2 squadrons of F-15E Strike Eagles to take down dozens of Iranian attack drones. British Royal Air Force planes will, too, shoot down a number of drones headed for Israel. 5 hours into the war it effectively started, Iran might consider the matter closed, content to have made its point, even though it didn't necessarily inflict much damage. But will Israel take this action as Iran intended? Will they see it as a stern warning to them and their allies? A warning to Jerusalem and the Israel Defense Forces that if they step over the line again, they can expect a considerably more severe response. But what happens if Tehran's attempt at intimidation fails and Israel counters? If this happens, it won't matter that Iran intentionally chose long-range attacks that it knew Israel could easily counter. It won't matter that no US facilities were hit. If Israel does immediately strike back, ignoring the potential fallout of an equal or stronger response, and in spite of the many requests for clemency coming from top US military officials and the Pentagon, we will be that much closer to a full-scale war. The Israelis, however, already stretched thin from the war they've been fighting with Hamas, might not be looking to enter another full-on war with Iran. But as they have in the past, the Israeli leadership will be feeling intense pressure to retaliate. Too strong of a response, though, and these 2 countries, as well as their allies, will almost certainly find themselves at war. Hour 6. After consulting his war cabinet, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is still facing a great deal of domestic pressure after being charged with fraud and corruption back in 2019, might feel he has no choice but to take a hard line against Iran's clear escalation. He might take into consideration that the so-called Axis of Resistance, a network that extends Tehran's influence across the Arab world, which most notably includes Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, Iran has taken plenty of shots at them before. Before now, however, neither Iran nor Israel has overtly attacked the other at home. The hostilities have never risen to the level of face-to-face military confrontation. It seems that the war in Gaza may have tipped the scales. Hour 7. Some members of the Israeli government will be absolutely determined to launch a fierce and immediate counterstrike, even though President Joe Biden has made it perfectly clear that the United States military won't be a part of any offensive operations. So to strike a balance, to not upset its Western friends while feeling compelled to respond, Israel will first strike at Iran's air defense systems, perhaps their most advanced systems, like the ones located at the Iranian airbase in Isfahan in central Iran, that are responsible for protecting the Natanz nuclear facility. For this attack, instead of making a bolder statement and sending fighter jets into Iranian airspace, Israel will deploy a small squadron of quadcopters to confuse Iran's air defenses, then launch a pair of missiles from Syrian airspace several hundred kilometers to the west. Jumping ahead to hour 10, this is when we truly find ourselves at the flashpoint of this war. For if Israel doesn't immediately follow up this tempered strike with another, more forceful attack, it will effectively put the ball back in Iran's court. Maybe this was enough and Iran is already planning another strike, or perhaps Tehran is suspicious of Israel's modest retaliation, believing it to be just the beginning of a larger operation. If either of these is true, Iran will go back on the offensive, launching more of its own strikes, acting before any of its missiles or aircraft can be destroyed on the ground, before the sky above Natanz can fill with Israeli jets. Hour 12. Iran and its proxies launch another swarm of drones and hundreds more ballistic and cruise missiles, increasing the size of its previous attack, which was already one of the largest barrages of this kind in military history. Once the air assault ends, we might also see Iran directing its proxy forces, most likely Hezbollah militants, to attack Israel's ground borders from Syria or Lebanon. In terms of manpower, Iran does have a substantial advantage, with approximately 1.2 million active and reserve military personnel and thousands of artillery systems, while Israel only has around 750,000 combined troops, many of whom are actively engaged in operations in Gaza, as well as maintaining a defensive posture in the north to counter the ongoing threat from Hezbollah. Israel does, however, have a much more formidable armored division that includes over 2,200 tanks, nearly twice as many as Iran is believed to have. Either way, though, the nations are still separated by several countries – Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. From border to border, that's a distance of nearly 1,000 kilometers, which makes a land-based conflict between national armies highly improbable. Not to mention that any attempt by Iran to deploy troops through Iraq and Syria would almost certainly provoke an immediate and devastating response from US forces positioned in the region. But that doesn't completely take an organized ground attack by Hezbollah off the table. In addition to an array of small arms, machine guns, and hundreds of thousands of rockets at its disposal, Hezbollah boasts a range of anti-tank and anti-air systems, thousands of drones, and dozens of tanks and other armored vehicles. The group has also already engaged in skirmishes with Israel along its northern border, as both sides have exchanged intermittent missile and drone strikes. Hour 17. Given a clear directive from Tehran, Hezbollah's leaders would likely move to step up their offensive operations in the north, isolating their attacks on the Galilee Panhandle, a finger of Israeli territory that juts into southern Lebanon, as they attempt to force IDF troops out once and for all. Mostly abandoned and overtaken by nature, the Finger of Galilee is a virtual no man's land. Even families who have lived in the area for generations have had to flee. When it comes to this sort of ground-level urban combat, Israel's advanced air defense systems aren't much help. They are great at intercepting rockets that fly in high arcs and are difficult to aim, but in areas like Galilee, Hezbollah fighters often use rocket-propelled grenades and anti-tank missiles, which allow for more precise line-of-sight targeting and fly low to the ground. At the outset of a full-scale war, if Hezbollah was able to fully occupy the Galilee Panhandle, it would give their forces, as well as other Iranian proxies, a direct route from Lebanon into northern Israel. But given the lack of progress they've made so far, this is unlikely. A naval element to this war would also be unlikely. Despite Iran's recent aggressions in and around the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman, including the seizure of the MCS Ares, a Portuguese-registered merchant vessel Tehran claimed to be linked to Israel. In preparation for war with Israel, Iran would likely use Navy assets to escort its commercial vessels to safety in the Red Sea, where its Yemeni proxies, the Houthis, have been creating havoc since 2018. This means that the primary battles of the war will continue to be fought in the air, with both sides utilizing its arsenal of missiles, jets, and drones. Hour 25. Israel gets ready to deploy one or all of its long-range assets, F-35 stealth fighter bombers and precision deep-strike intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. But even if Israel has better planes and a handful of nuclear-equipped submarines, Iran has the largest and most diverse ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. Israel might have more capable ballistic missiles, but they've got fewer of them and less of a variety. Most of Iran's missiles were acquired from foreign allies, primarily North Korea, and Iran is still dependent on foreign suppliers for many key components and equipment, but it does have the technical and industrial capacity to develop long-range missiles, including ICBMs. In fact, the Islamic Republic is the only country to have developed a missile with a 2,000-kilometer range without having nuclear weapons first. Hour 26. Hezbollah fighters attempt to push over the border in the north, and Iran continues to send waves of missiles and drones toward key Israeli military targets. Non-nuclear ICBMs take flight in both directions, crossing paths in the sky high above Jordan and Iraq on their way to Tehran and Jerusalem. At this point, this long-simmering conflict that was previously limited to secret assassinations, cyber attacks, nuclear sabotage, and isolated war-by-proxy land, sea, and air attacks will explode into a multinational conflict that directly and indirectly involves at least two nuclear power states. It's unlikely, but not impossible, that after the first round of ICBMs are exchanged, Israel will escalate to a nuclear response. Hypothetically, if they sent a cruise missile with a 150-kiloton nuclear warhead into the heart of Tehran, the blast would kill nearly 500,000 people, vaporizing everything within 1.35 square kilometers of the point of impact. Hour 30. If Israel does use a nuclear weapon against Iran, it will leave the world in a state of shock. Iran, that we know of, has no equivalent response. For Tehran has repeatedly denied having a nuclear weapons program, even if Supreme Leader Ayatollah al-Khamenei has also said that if they wanted to have one, their enemies wouldn't be able to stop them. If this is true, and Iran is unable to retaliate with nukes, either on its own or via one of its allies, the war between Iran and Israel effectively comes to an end. But the diplomatic consequences that Israel will face for this are nearly incomprehensible. Previously, the primary concern among the Israeli leadership has been that a nuclear-armed Iran would only be emboldened, increasing its support for its proxies, if not directly providing them with nuclear weapons to use against the Jewish state. After all, if Israel's nuclear arsenal hasn't been enough to deter Iran from launching a conventional strike, then what might happen once Iran is bringing nukes of its own to the proverbial bargaining table? Recently, an advisor to Iran's supreme leader said they'd have no choice but to build a nuclear bomb if Iran's existence were to be threatened. But let's rewind a bit. Long before the nuclear option hits the table, but as soon as Iran's first missiles take flight, what we're likely going to see is squadrons of Israeli fighters screaming towards Iran, targeting various air defense systems and missile launch facilities all across the country. The Israelis will be flying the very best US-manufactured combat aircraft that were specifically designed according to IAF requirements, meaning that the Israeli Air Force will certainly have the upper hand. Iran's Air Force employs approximately 37,000 personnel. However, years of international sanctions have significantly restricted its access to modern military technology. It has only a few dozen operational strike aircraft, Russian jets and aging US models acquired before the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The most capable of which is probably its Sukhoi 24s, a supersonic all-weather tactical bomber developed in the Soviet Union. The Russians have apparently tweaked some of theirs to carry tactical nuclear weapons, but the Su-24 was first developed in the late 1960s, a sign of the relative weakness of Iran's air force. One thing Iran does seem to have an abundance of, however, is drones. Tehran has provided more than 1,000 Shahed-136 UAVs, as well as Shahed-131 and Mohyah-6 UAVs to support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, so we can only assume they have thousands more to spare. Israel, on the other hand, has hundreds of F-15, F-16, and F-35 multi-purpose jet fighters, including stealthy variants like the F-35I Adir and less stealthy variants like the F-15I Ram. The Israeli Air Force does lack long-range bombers, though they might not need them in this war, though they do have a small fleet of repurposed Boeing 707s that serve as fueling tankers, which would allow its fighters to reach Iran and carry out multiple waves of precision sorties. Israel has also become a pioneer in drone technology. Among other assets, Israel Aerospace Industries has produced the IAI Heron pilotless plane that can travel 10.5 kilometers over 52 hours of continuous flight. But it's in terms of their air defense capabilities that Israel has an even larger advantage. Developed after the Gulf War with billions of dollars worth of help from the United States, Israel's multi-layer aerial defense system, along with its array of top-of-the-line fighter aircraft, gives them several additional options for shooting down long-range Iranian drones and missiles. The Arrow 3, which can intercept ballistic missiles above the Earth's atmosphere, is their highest altitude system, while an earlier model, Arrow 2, works at lower altitudes. Their mid-range system, known as David's Sling, is best suited to counter ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, while their so-called Iron Dome takes care of any short-range threats, like rockets and mortars, but can also, in theory, take down any of the more powerful missiles that the Arrow systems or David's Sling might miss. After determining that an incoming rocket is a threat, the Iron Dome will fire an interceptor, only if that threat will likely do damage to a populated area or important infrastructure. These systems are also linked to US bases in the region to facilitate an expedited response from coalition partners. This means that a large number of Iran's assets, particularly drones, will be shot down by Allied aircraft long before reaching Israel. It also means that we can expect to see, even during the earliest stages of the war, a notable upswelling of Allied defensive support. With all that said, if cooler heads prevail and Iran and Israel can both refrain from trading ICBMs and potentially nukes, this war will look much different. At around hour 25, instead of every major city in both Israel and Iran being turned to rubble and ash, we could see allies on both sides start to mobilize. After some diplomatic posturing, the US will likely step in, utilizing its full array of strategic offensive assets, cruise missiles, B-52 bombers, sub-launched ballistic missiles, as well as carrier and land-based jet fighters, to launch a sweeping attack against Iran's most valuable military assets. An attack that would likely be closely coordinated with Israel, if not performed jointly. Hour 30. Iran's only state ally in the Middle East is Syria, but the government of President Bashar al-Assad would probably not be too much help, given its ongoing struggle to re-establish control over the country following the outbreak of the civil war in 2011. Tehran has good relations with Moscow, but Putin's war in Ukraine would seriously limit Russia's ability to back them up, especially if the US is already directly involved. Iran is somewhat friendly with China too, which has brought Iranian oil in the past, but Beijing has current and future Western sanctions to worry about. This means that Iran's best hope for outside support is its axis of resistance. If the Iranian leadership were to instruct elements of some or all of these forces to begin a consolidated attack on Israel, the IDF, which is already committed to its war with Hamas, would be stretched very thin as it tried to defend Israel's borders. A coalition of Axis forces would do its best to push in and occupy Israeli territory, but it's hard to say how effective that would be. Hezbollah has been fighting with Israel for almost 20 years, while Iran-backed militias have continued to target US forces in Iraq and Syria, and Yemen's Houthis have continued to launch missiles and drones at Israel and carry out attacks in the Red Sea. But this regional coalition, whose members include the Syrian government, Hamas, and other militant groups from Iraq to Yemen, have only had marginal success, due partially to their differing priorities and unique domestic challenges. In fact, Hamas has already called on the Axis for help battling the IDF in Gaza. The Houthis have been on the losing end of several encounters with the US Navy, and as for Hezbollah, it took Lebanon years to rebuild after its war with Israel in 2006, and now, half a decade into a financial crisis that's driven up poverty and hollowed out the country's governing institutions, the leadership in Beirut aren't eager to enter another full-scale war with Israel and its allies. The US, now that it's found itself bankrolling Ukraine's defense against Russia and having fought two costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan over the past 2 decades, doesn't want to see the conflict in Gaza spiral out into a war between nations either. But that doesn't mean it won't. If the US, as well as Israel's allies in Europe, truly want to deter regional war in the Middle East, they will need to convince Iran to rein in both its proxies and its nuclear program. Hour 48. As the Israel-dominated US-backed aerial war continues, we're going to see a serious escalation of the cyber war that's already been raging between these two countries. Instead of direct military engagement on the ground, Iran might aim to undermine Israel's military defenses and domestic stability. Since the conflict in Gaza began, cyber attacks against Israel have tripled. So in a war with Iran, Israel would need to brace itself for increased cyber hostility that will likely come in the forms of attacks on its information technology sector intended to disrupt, steal, or leak sensitive information. In the past, cyber attacks have allowed Iran to take regular shots at Israel while minimizing the risk of direct US action. Another way Iran might look to minimize the risk of pulling Israel's allies into the war or avoid a full-scale regional war altogether is by leaning on asymmetrical warfare tactics, like targeted assassinations or attacks on Israeli embassies and consulates in the West. Indirect actions that have allowed Iran's leaders to claim small, retaliatory victories without broadening the conflict beyond their control. If a war between Israel and Iran reaches this point, however, there will be no turning back. So why does Iran seem determined to escalate things now? Perhaps after the Hamas attack on October 7, 2023, Tehran smelled blood in the water, leading them to a false impression that Israel could no longer defend itself alone. But given what's happened so far, that doesn't seem to be the case. And if this war really does happen, Iran might be facing a less patient, more ruthless Israel out to prove itself. In terms of who wins this war though, Iran or Israel, the reality is no one wins when a string of violent conflicts rooted in ideological differences is allowed to slowly escalate into a war between nations. But given Israel's success so far in defending itself against Iran's most credible threat, it's doubtful that Tehran possesses the military might needed to dominate this conflict in the air, on the ground, or at sea. So it's probably in Iran's best interest to consider the matter settled and go back to its previous war-by-proxy strategy. It would be wise, too, for the Iranian leadership to consider the level of strategic accuracy Israel has already displayed during its strike on their air defense systems in Isfahan. This should really tell Iran two things. One, Israel would also like to avoid a full-scale war, and two, it has the ability to hit whatever target it wants, whenever it wants. As the Israeli leadership decides what to do next, it would probably be wise of them to take a look at their own history. Back in 1991, during the Gulf War, Iraq fired 40 Scud missiles at Israeli civilian targets, killing 2 civilians and injuring several hundred people, in a deliberate attempt to draw Israel into the Gulf War. If then Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir had taken the bait though, it would have fractured the 42-country coalition formed by US President George H.W. Bush that had aligned against Saddam Hussein after he ordered the invasion and occupation of Kuwait. To encourage Israel not to retaliate, the Bush administration sent over a shipment of Patriot missiles. Although not the most effective weapon for intercepting Iraq's Soviet-made Scud missiles, the Patriots did help persuade Shamir to stay out of the US-led war. And in the end, the anti-Iraq coalition held and quickly defeated Saddam. Clearly, Shamir understood the value of both international cooperation and restraint. Netanyahu, Israel's current president, was a deputy prime minister at the time and is considered by many to have been Shamir's mentee. Time will tell if he indeed follows in his mentor's footsteps. Since the earliest years of Israel's existence, largely due to numerous wars intended to erase it from the map, the country has maintained a self-defense strategy rooted in the notion that the best defense is a good offense. Formerly known as the Begin Doctrine, this policy was named after Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who famously authorized the bombing of Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981. As work on the plant neared completion, a plant Israel believed would have the capacity to produce plutonium for warheads, Prime Minister Begin dispatched 8 F-16s to preemptively destroy it. It seems, however, that Netanyahu's government is taking a softer approach when it comes to Iran, who in defiance of Western pressure has pushed on with its nuclear program, claiming but not proving that it does not intend to weaponize the program. Since Iran launched its attack in April, there has been intense speculation as to whether Israel will lean back on its previous nuclear defense strategy or simply hope Tehran won't dare to cross that line. With its attack on Iran's air defense systems that were guarding at least one uranium enrichment site at Natanz, Israel has shown that it could also have hit several major nuclear facilities if it wanted to. But maybe not. Israel has known for years that an attack on Iran's numerous and well-fortified nuclear facilities would be much more difficult than its 1981 campaign in Iraq. Iran is larger and farther away, and taking out its facilities would require a sustained bombing campaign by the Israeli Air Force, which is more accustomed to limited precision strikes. For now at least, it looks as though both sides have taken a step back from the brink of war, but the Middle East is a far more dangerous and precarious place because of these recent events. Both Israel and Iran have crossed a critical red line, both militarily and symbolically, and it's certainly possible that either country could be the one to push this conflict past the point of no return. But what do you think? Have Iran and Israel already reached that point? Are these two countries, as well as their allies, headed for a full-scale war? And if they are, who would win? A superpower can be defined as a state with the ability to project power or exert influence on a global scale, usually in more than one region at a time. The United States has been the world's sole superpower since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, holding an unrivaled degree of economic and military dominance around the globe. Even today, with the rise of China, the US still remains by far the most powerful country, still far outstripping competitors in national power. It still has 3 times China's wealth and 5 times its military capabilities. And that's not to mention its enormous advantages in geography, demographics, and more. All things considered, it doesn't seem likely that the US is losing its status as global hegemon anytime soon. But hypothetically, what would happen if America found itself in a conflict against the entire rest of the world? Would the country still have the power to achieve victory, or would it be worn down and defeated? Today, we'll take a closer look at these questions, with a USA versus the world wargame. First, it goes without saying that such a scenario is extremely unlikely, if not downright impossible, during our lifetimes. Because of its diplomatic and economic ties around the world, as well as its huge arsenal of nuclear weapons, the US has almost entirely removed the possibility of real war with Europe and many other countries. But playing out the remote possibility still shows us a lot about US power and how it might look in the coming years. For the purpose of this video, we'll exclude nuclear weapons and assume that such a conflict would break out after a period of heightened global tensions rather than as a surprise attack. So who would really matter? The biggest challenges to the US in terms of actual military capability would certainly be China. Western European nations would be a close second, as they are wealthy and have stockpiles of advanced weapons and technology. While Russia, once considered to be America's main military challenger, its invasion of Ukraine has made clear that the country is something of a paper tiger, especially if its nuclear stockpile is out of the equation. India is another potential player, with the world's largest population and substantial military hardware. Together, China, Russia, India, and Europe account for the majority of the world's military spending outside of the US. In our hypothetical, let's say these countries all align against the US, with the rest of the world primarily contributing materiel or financial support. While this is extremely simplified, the fact of the matter is that most countries do not have the resources to project power beyond their borders or immediate region, making an attack on the US impossible. So let's say war breaks out. The first major difficulty with a global offensive against the US would be geographic. Surrounded by water on 2 sides, and Mexico and Canada to the north and south, any physical attack against the US would face major challenges. First, it would mean mounting either an enormous amphibious assault from one of the coasts or attempting to invade via land. But the deserts in the southwest and the Great Lakes in the Midwest insulate the country's major population centers from a potential invasion staged from Canada and Mexico. An invasion from outside North America would require massive fronts and long supply chains across the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans, leading to a dramatic reduction of overall power projection. Military expert Dylan Lurk has noted that even the largest amphibious assault in history on either the west coast or the east coast would be too insignificant to acquire an effective beachhead. If every foreign power managed to coordinate such a massive operation, and do so while remaining undetected under the enormous reach and power of the American intelligence apparatus, it would still have issues building up a force of any significant size before being pushed back into the sea. In addition, the strategic Hawaiian island chain acts as a gateway to the US mainland for attacks from the Pacific and is protected by a significant military presence. Similarly, military installations in Alaska provide protection against any invasion from along the Arctic or Northwest. An attack from Mexico would probably be more feasible due to the Great Lakes blocking much of the Canadian border. But California and Texas have the largest concentration of defense industries and military bases in the country, thus providing an effective deterrent from any attack, with the southwestern desert spanning the 2 regions. The Southwest is also home to multiple heavily armed military bases, such as the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico or NORAD headquarters in Colorado. An attack launched from Canada on the Midwest or the West would be limited to light infantry and would likely fail to take over population centers or other important strategic points, since there is mostly rural farmland and unpopulated national parks along the border, along with air bases located hundreds of miles south. Dr. Beckley makes this point as well, stating that the United States is a natural economic hub and military fortress. It's packed with resources and has more economic arteries like navigable waterways and ports than the rest of the world combined. And even if the US military was unable to stop an invasion, the huge diversity of terrain would also provide US military personnel or militias with the ability to conduct guerrilla warfare. The US is also by far the most heavily armed civilian population in the world, with a staggering 120 guns for every 100 people. This means that even if a coalition of other countries was able to actually get troops into the US, it would end up facing an incredibly well-armed and pissed-off insurgency. On the other hand, over the past 80 years, the US has developed a worldwide infrastructure of military bases, supply lines, and the world's largest air and naval transport fleets. This contains hundreds of ships and aircraft, more than the entire fleet of most countries. The lack of global mobility would be an enormous issue for any coalition facing the US. In the weeks before the sort of global conflict in our hypothetical, the US would most likely pull its forces out of the most vulnerable, non-American bases in Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, concentrating its resources in places where the US exercises greater territorial control to act as staging areas. Some areas would be considered too important to abandon, especially those supporting the military's supply chain, US oil assets, and key territorial choke points. One of the first battlefields in any conflict between the US and the rest of the world would be the Middle East. Here, one major aim of the DoD, as carried out by US Central Command, would be to secure critical US oil refineries and distribution centers, as well as gain control of the sea lanes used for transporting oil out of the region. As of 2022, 80.4% of the world's oil reserves are located in countries belonging to the international oil cartel OPEC, and 67.1% of OPEC reserves are in the Middle East. Similarly, over 60% of the world's oil passes through shipping lanes in the Arabian Sea alone. While the US has reduced its presence in the region in recent years, a global conflict would almost certainly cause a reorientation. Possessing the world's 12th largest oil reserves means that the US could theoretically go self-sufficient in wartime, but control of some Middle Eastern reserves would make guaranteeing its supply much easier. Similarly, it would allow the US to deny oil to much of the rest of the world and undermine the coalition's economies and military production. Europe, which would represent the US's most significant adversary, receives a significant amount of its crude oil and natural gas from the Middle East. This means that US military control of the region would harm Europe's ability to sustain a war effort for any extended period of time. China would face a similar issue, as over half of all its oil comes from the Middle East, making the region among one of the most likely fronts in a global war with the US. At the start of the conflict, the US would first strike at oil-related facilities across the Middle East, using carrier-based strike aircraft plus medium and long-range ballistic missiles. US power projection means that even without bases in Afghanistan, the military could easily hit targets anywhere from the Mediterranean to the Strait of Hormuz. While regional powers could offer some resistance, none of them have anywhere close to the manpower or firepower needed to stop the US in an all-out war. While Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and several others do have modern fighter jets and other weaponry, even they would not last very long up against the might of the DoD. And because each is an independent country, intelligence and resource sharing among them would also be limited, further reducing the region's ability to stand up to the US in a shooting war. Most of their assets' signals would also likely be jammed by America's powerful electronic warfare capabilities, which would disrupt enemy communications, targeting, and guidance systems across the region. The greatest threat to US control of the Middle East in our scenario comes from ground-based air defenses, as even older systems can shoot unsuspecting fighter jets from the sky. However, unlike Russia's recent experience in Ukraine, the US has actually proven that it can effectively destroy another nation's air defense network, as it did during Desert Storm in the 1990s. Today, this might be even easier due to the enormous arsenal of drones the US has access to. Most US losses in the air would likely come from such drones, as well as fourth-generation jets like the F-15, while its more modern F-18s and F-22s could evade all but the best air defense systems. After establishing air superiority, the US would then work to control all choke points into and out of the region, especially the easily blocked Suez Canal, where over 12% of global trade passes through. If it was able to effectively keep regional control over the Middle East and its resources, the US would have a decent shot at winning against the rest of the world. A second major battlefield would be the Pacific, where the US would probably use its fleet to keep China and other East Asian nations contained and stop them from attacking the West Coast. This could mean either a blockade of major trade and supply routes, as well as using islands like Hawaii and Guam to stage its own offensives. It would also utilize its fleet of aircraft carriers heavily in the Asia-Pacific region. As of this video, there are 47 aircraft carriers around the world. The largest 11 of these are all nuclear-powered carriers belonging to the US, which have more than twice the combined total deck space of every other country combined. The Pacific Fleet fields 7 of these, and in a global war could use them to deny access to anything approaching the US mainland. Again, oil would be another top concern, and the US could use its massive navy to gain control of the Strait of Malacca, which carries up to 40% of the world's trade every year. While less easily choked off than the Suez Canal, a US blockade of this waterway would also devastate most economies in Asia, giving the US serious economic leverage over China, India, and others. The US would also likely exert its naval power in the South China Sea, which it could use to launch strikes against China, Japan, the Philippines, or any other regional power. Heavy fighting would ensue across the sea and air domains all around the South China Sea, and could account for the heaviest US casualties in any theater of this hypothetical war. Another potential target is Taiwan, where over 90% of the world's advanced microchips are currently fabricated. The US might even need to seize and try to occupy the island to stop the global coalition from dominating the production of modern electronics. To do so, the US would inevitably have to challenge China as well. Chinese air defenses and ballistic missile capabilities are already powerful alone, and if combined with the assets of every other country in the region, could potentially pose a problem for the US. The naval base on Guam would be especially vulnerable to strikes by ballistic missiles, which could overwhelm its limited air defenses. Even so, the US Navy is so powerful that every country in the East Pacific combined would be occupied with fending it off, and probably could not launch their own strikes on the US mainland. And because the US Navy is larger than those of the next 8 countries combined, it could easily fight in 2 or 3 theaters at once, making simultaneous blockades of Europe, the Middle East, and Asia-Pacific a real possibility. Another aspect of a global war would involve submarines, which unsurprisingly the US has more of than almost anyone else. Its fleet contains 53 fast-attack submarines, 14 nuclear-capable ballistic missile subs, and 4 guided missile subs. Even without using the world-ending nuclear capabilities of an Ohio-class submarine, this massive fleet would allow the US to launch stealth attacks on enemy naval vessels anywhere in the world, completely undetected. While America would be far more hard-pressed to fend off a global coalition on the ground, at sea the US stands a much better chance of victory. A third global area of battle would be the Americas, where the US would have the greatest ability to marshal forces and project power. And because Mexico, Canada, and other countries in the region are far less powerful, there is a good chance the US could blockade, control, or destroy the majority of their military and economic resources. Canada and Venezuela are both obvious targets because of their status as oil producers, and in a global war the US would probably aim to shut down or take control of resources in both. Another obvious target is the Panama Canal, which serves as the gateway between the Atlantic and Pacific, and where 40% of all US container shipping flows through. The US controlled the canal from 1903 to 1979, and would try to seize it again during a global war. This would also provide a choke point against the militaries of Central and South America. Chile is another potential target as the country supplies 28% of the world's copper, critical for the production of modern electronics. Now, obviously, a hypothetical alliance of every other country in the world would have the numerical advantage in overall troops and economic resources. But keep in mind that as of 2022, US military spending was $877 billion, constituting 40% of the global total and more than the next 10 countries combined. Today, this enormous sum still only accounts for about 3% of the country's GDP. In a global war, this percentage would almost certainly increase and could rise to similar levels as World War II, when US military spending accounted for over 40% of national GDP. Today, that would mean somewhere close to $10 trillion a year in military spending from the US alone, nearly 5 times the global total from 2022. Astronomical numbers like these mean that a war of attrition against America would also be likely to fail, as the country could outspend the rest of the world several times over for many years. To gain a true strategic edge over the US, a global coalition would have to somehow outgun and outspend the Defense Department, while also maintaining their own smaller economies. Another crucial domain in a global conflict with the US would play out in cyberspace. This would probably be the first line of contact between the warring parties, as both sides would attempt to gain information superiority and take each other's systems offline. While US Cyber Command would almost certainly be overwhelmed with attacks by many actors at once, America could also use its own highly effective attacks to shut down enemy power grids, computer networks, weapons, electronics, and much more. And while it's not as dominant in cyberspace as in the real world, the US still has by far the most capable and best-funded capabilities in the world. In the 2024 fiscal year, US cyber spending will rise to more than $25 billion, and the country continues to top every ranking of national cyber power. However, this domain would also be one of the biggest dangers to the US in a global war, as cyber attacks are notoriously difficult to predict and defend against. A well-placed cyber attack by a less powerful nation could still be catastrophic, and would probably be a more serious immediate threat to US citizens than a kinetic strike on the country. However, again, we have no way of knowing how much American cyber spending would increase in a total war, or how quickly that would lead to new capabilities. All the elements point to a big conclusion. The US is so powerful that it could take on the rest of the world for weeks or months with no certain winner. Because of this, such a hypothetical conflict would likely become a war of attrition in both the physical and digital worlds. The US would work to starve the world's other major powers of oil, war supplies, and other vital resources, while attempting to preserve its own. A true assault on the US mainland would be extremely difficult because of the country's size, geographic positioning, and incredibly well-armed military and civilian population. Because of the US military's global presence, most of the fighting would likely happen elsewhere, opening theaters of war everywhere from the Middle East to South America and East Asia. In the end, the victor would almost certainly be whichever side could outlast the other, both in terms of military and economic resources. While the scenario of America versus the entire world is obviously an absurd one, it does give us a useful picture of just how powerful the US military really is. With resources greater than those of most individual countries and nearly limitless power projection, even a conventional conflict against the US would be very hard to achieve true victory. Add in the country's continued dominance in cyberspace, and it's not all clear whether the rest of the world would actually be able to win such a war. And all of the speculation above excludes the most powerful part of the equation: nuclear weapons. Because of the principle of mutually assured destruction, no country really wants to use them today. However, it's worth noting that the US has over 1,400 actively deployed nukes, and in any real global conflict, they could be used to give any non-nuclear country a very permanent end. And even in a very distant hypothetical like the one above, we should remember that the cost of human life in any worldwide conflict would be staggering, and that even winners in such a war would suffer. But what do you think? Would the US really be able to win a war against the rest of the world, or would the country eventually be overwhelmed? A potential hostile encounter with China now dominates the United States military planning, and vice versa. What would a war look like? Who would win? Before we get to that, let's take a minute to explain why our military experts have decided to discuss this potentially very real and, quite frankly, terrifying scenario. After the end of World War II and especially the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States emerged as the world's preeminent power, supreme in military, economic, technological, and even cultural influence. After 1991, the United States was so strong that some experts believed it had transcended superpower status. According to their theory, it had instead ascended into a hyperpower, a state that dominates all other states in every domain in the international system. The world had become a unipolar one, even leading some observers in the 1990s and part of the 2000s, most famously Francis Fukuyama, to declare an end of history and the final triumph of liberal democracy as the last form of human political organization. However, the 2000s and 2010s threw some cold water on this theory. Costly American military expeditions in the Middle East, the 2008 financial crisis, Russia's expansionist ambitions under Vladimir Putin, Iran and North Korea's nuclear programs, and above all, the economic and military rise of China, all undermine the notion of unipolarity. By the middle of the 2010s, the Pentagon proposed its third offset strategy, which tacitly acknowledged that the unipolar moment was, if not over, at least under threat by the emerging coalition of authoritarian powers, led by China, who were opposed to the international order led by the United States. The United States was therefore shifting its military posture away from the counterterrorism and counterinsurgency campaigns which dominated its strategy following 9/11, when the unipolar moment was near its height, and toward competition with and deterrence of other states, especially China. This is why the US is currently heavily oriented toward preparing for a potential adversarial encounter with China. Let's dive into what kind of conflict might unfold and which side could emerge victorious. We can begin with a comparison of the size of the two forces. With 1.4 billion people, China is the second most populous country in the world, having been surpassed by India in April 2023. It has the world's largest military with almost 2.2 million active personnel. The United States military ranks third in size with almost 1.4 million active duty personnel. When adding in reservists, the numbers increase to 3.35 million and 2.2 million, respectively. China also has the world's largest navy, with 425 fleet units in its active naval inventory as of August 21, 2023. This number excludes smaller patrol ships and other auxiliaries, presumably its huge fishing fleet that has acted as a de facto maritime militia in disputed waters. Meanwhile, the United States has 243 units in its active naval inventory, excluding smaller patrol ships and other auxiliaries. The United States has the world's largest air force, with 5,217 active aircraft as of 2022. China ranks a distant third with 1,991. When counting the total number of military aircraft with all branches combined, China's numerical disadvantage in the skies becomes more pronounced, as the United States has 13,247 aircraft among all of its military branches, while China ranks a very distant third again at 3,285. When it comes to air power at sea, the United States has 2,464 aircraft, while China's People's Liberation Army Navy (PLAN) has only 437. This is an important distinction and reveals that many of China's advantages are only surface deep. The numerical difference in the makeup of the two forces is important. A war between the United States and China would take place in the area close to the Chinese mainland, in the territory around the First Island chain, a string of countries that stretch from Japan to Indonesia. China would be able to concentrate all of its resources there, and its supply lines will be much shorter. In contrast, the United States has global commitments, with Russia exerting pressure on Eastern Europe, Iran and its allies in the Middle East, and North Korea on the Korean Peninsula. All of these hotspots demand America's attention. The United States would also need to ship its supplies and replacements across the Pacific. These supply lines will be long and vulnerable to attack, the tyranny of distance. The United States has qualitative advantages, however. China's army has not seen major combat operations in almost half a century. The last time was the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979, where the PLA had a poor showing indeed against the Vietnamese. In contrast, the United States military has had decades of combat experience and a buildup of institutional knowledge that the PLA simply does not have. It has more experienced soldiers, sailors, marines, and officers. The Chinese military has engaged in a large buildup and conducted extensive drills and war games with partners such as Russia, but there is no substitute for the real thing. Russia's poor performance in Ukraine shows that, and its armed forces had more experience than China's currently does. The United States Air Force not only has numerical superiority over the People's Liberation Army Air Force, but a qualitative advantage in those planes, although it may not seem this way at first. China has one fifth-generation fighter jet, the Chengdu J-20. China may have over 200 of these in service, a number which could hit as high as 1,000 by 2030 if current production rates continue. It may also have over 240 of the advanced 4th generation plus J-16 fighters in service. This is a formidable force for the PLAAF. In contrast, the United States has only built 187 of its best 5th generation fighter jets, the F-22 Raptor. The last one was delivered in 2012, and the Air Force has no plans to order any more. However, the United States can supplement the extremely high-quality Raptor with the 5th generation F-35 Lightning II. Over 960 F-35s have been delivered as of August 2023. The United States also has thousands of advanced 4th generation fighter jets like the F-15 Eagle, F-16 Fighting Falcon, and the F-18 Super Hornet available. And all of them come with better trained and more experienced pilots than their Chinese counterparts. Although China has closed the gap, the United States is still supreme in the world's skies, and in an all-out air battle, the Americans would eventually establish air superiority. The war at sea is also not favorable to China. The People's Liberation Army Navy may have a bigger fleet in terms of sheer numbers, but the United States Navy has purposely chosen to pursue a different strategy than its Chinese counterpart. Numbers aren't everything. Many of the Chinese vessels are small and would prove relatively poor in a military confrontation. In contrast, the USN operates sturdier, more powerful vessels. For example, the PLAN has 3 aircraft carriers, only one of which uses a modern catapult system. The USN has 11, all of which are more modern than the first 2 Chinese carriers. China has plans to make more aircraft carriers in the years to come, but as of now, the United States has a significant advantage. Additionally, China has a serious shortage of trained naval aviators. The PLAN is trying its best to catch up, but it's still far short. As a conflict between the United States and China would mainly be fought in the seas and skies around the First Island chain, with comparatively limited land operations, the traditional balance of power should favor the United States in a head-to-head confrontation. However, China has recognized this and has adapted with a strategy of anti-access area denial, A2AD. One of the things that marked the United States' emergence as a supposed hyperpower following the end of the Cold War was its ability to project power anywhere on the globe within hours. Perhaps one of the best examples was the Navy SEAL raid on Osama bin Laden's compound in 2011. This complicated military operation occurred without the Pakistani government's knowledge, and there was little that Pakistan could do about it except raise a protest afterward. After the end of the Cold War, the United States had no peer competitor in the international system, which could prevent it from using its military resources in the way it wanted. However, this began to change with China's military buildup. China's A2AD strategy sounds complicated, but it's relatively simple. First, it is to deny its adversaries freedom of movement in the disputed region, anti-access. To do this, it will utilize certain assets, especially cheap precision ballistic and cruise missiles, to destroy key targets in offensive strikes. The second leg of the strategy is to use defensive systems to deny the enemy the ability to operate in territory controlled by it or other friendly powers. For example, China would try to use its stockpile of thousands of cheap ballistic missiles to destroy expensive American ships, especially aircraft carriers, bases, and long supply lines to prevent the United States from moving into disputed regions like the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. Cheap ballistic missiles destroying expensive carrier groups would not only prove deadly and costly, it would prevent the United States from being able to project its power into the First Island chain and the Chinese interior. This is the opposite of what happened during the Third Taiwan Strait crisis in 1995-96, when the United States sent 2 carrier groups to the area. The Chinese did not have the resources to deal with this projection of American power and had to back down. The story would be very different today, and the move far more dangerous on the part of the United States. Chinese air and missile attacks on US naval assets, supply lines, and bases in Japan, South Korea, and even as far out as Guam would take advantage of the tyranny of distance to prevent the United States from being able to fight the war for the long haul. The United States might be able to establish air and naval superiority with its higher quality planes and ships in a confrontation, but it could have a hard time replacing losses and bringing more resources over. Meanwhile, China would be operating close to its own territory. The supply lines would be much shorter and easier to defend with its air and sea defense systems, and all of China's resources would be concentrated here. In addition to these kinetic assets, China has tried to develop its electronic and cybernetic warfare capabilities to further disrupt the US military capability. China's military buildup and its A2AD weapons has posed the most serious challenge to US military might since the Cold War. It is why many experts believe that the United States is slowly but steadily losing its traditional military superiority in the Indo-Pacific region. To defeat China's A2AD strategy, the Pentagon developed its third offset strategy. China hopes that the development of advanced A2AD capabilities will deter the United States from even disputing its expansionist moves. This is why for the Pentagon, it is important to maintain forward presence capability. It must be able to defeat the attempts to impede the movement of American military forces and surge them forward in a combat-credible posture. According to the US Army's Center for Lessons Learned, the third offset strategy involves forces that are or can rapidly get forward, survive a withering Chinese or Russian assault, and blunt the adversary's aggression. It is almost reminiscent of a boxer trying to duck and slip past a barrage of long jabs to get inside his opponent's range and deliver power blows. The United States is currently developing technologies to better prepare it to pursue this strategy. For example, these new technologies would involve better artificial intelligence to enable human officers to make faster and more informed decisions. The integration of human and unmanned platforms, like the Sea Hunter autonomous drone ship, would also be part of the third offset strategy. Other technologies like shipborne hypersonic missiles and the Helios laser system can also be considered part of the third offset strategy, as it is hoped that the laser will add a layer of protection to the US Navy's ships from the Chinese ballistic and cruise missile threat. The laser is also ideal for countering drones. The first Helios laser began seeing service in the third quarter of fiscal year 2022, and the Navy requested $35 million in its 2023 budget for Helios systems, when they will begin to become operational at sea. However, as dazzling as the third offset strategy technologies are, they are still works in progress. The United States neglected countermeasures against China's A2AD strategy as it pursued its counterinsurgency and counterterrorism efforts in the War on Terror. Under current conditions, the United States military still uses many technologies and systems that are not well designed to counter the strategy China is pursuing. China still cannot defeat the United States in a head-to-head military confrontation, but because of geography, it does not necessarily need to. All it needs to do is prevent the United States from projecting enough power past the First Island chain to defeat its expansionist ambitions. As part of its strategy, American military bases in Japan would be targeted in the opening shots of the war, to destroy troops and equipment, prevent the stockpiling of supplies, and disrupt the United States strategy in the region. Air defense systems would take down some of the incoming missiles, but China has thousands in its arsenal, and its attacks would certainly do a great deal of damage. Wargames done at the Pentagon and defense think tanks have repeatedly confirmed these disadvantages. In a January 2023 scenario run by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the United States, with the help of Japan and Taiwan, defeated an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, but the casualties were enormous, with losses in dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and tens of thousands of military personnel, with the US position on the international stage undermined for years afterward. China suffered heavily too. However, CSIS warned that deterrence needed to be strengthened immediately. Other wargames were even less kind. A 2020 wargame run by the Pentagon over Taiwan and other scenarios had the United States failing miserably because gathering ships, aircraft, and other forces in a way that would let them reinforce one another made them sitting ducks for Chinese missile attacks. To make matters worse, the United States lost access to its electronic networks from the get-go, upending the information dominance strategy it has used so successfully starting in the Gulf War. In response to the 2020 wargame, the Pentagon is looking to shore up its contested logistics, possibly through the use of rockets to fly above the war zone. It's also looking to find ways to aggregate power virtually rather than physically. Then Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General John Hyten said of it, "You have to aggregate the mass fires, but it doesn't have to be a physical aggregation. It could be a virtual aggregation for multiple domains. Acting at the same time under a single command structure allows the fire to come in on anybody. It allows you to disaggregate to survive." He admitted this was exceedingly difficult to do, however. Finally, the United States would need to improve the defense of its networks against hackers, with a hacker-proof combat cloud. For now, though, these things are only speculation. What is not, however, is the United States' advantage in submarine warfare. China's missile capability has made it increasingly dangerous for the United States and its allies to project power behind the first island chain with surface ships, but the submarine force is much better protected. That's why China raised such a big protest about the AUKUS deal that would give Australia nuclear-powered submarines. Submarines are ideal for the implementation of the United States' third offset strategy. American nuclear-powered submarines can operate for months. They are quiet and dive deep, making them difficult to detect. They can also launch conventional or nuclear-armed ballistic or cruise missiles to strike sensitive targets. The United States submarine fleet would make any invasion of Taiwan or other amphibious operations in the first island chain a costly proposition for the Chinese military. The presence of these submarines also gives the United States significant conventional or nuclear first strike options to attack targets on land, such as Chinese military installations, which house the ballistic missiles that are such a threat to surface ships and land bases. China's PLAN is trying to close the submarine gap. At the moment, though, the bulk of its underwater fleet consists of diesel-electric submarines. They are quieter than nuclear submarines when running on electric power, but most surface to charge their batteries and are much louder when running on diesel power during this process. As of March 2023, China has a fleet of 56 submarines, but only 6 of them are nuclear-powered. The disparity means that the United States can carry out stealthier and longer operations under the water than China's Navy can. If a war did break out between the United States and China, the US submarine fleet would swing into action and attack Chinese naval assets, land bases, and shipping. The latter is especially important and reveals the United States' ace in the hole. China depends heavily on foreign food and energy imports. From its perspective, China's attempt to expand its influence in the South China Sea can be seen as an act of self-preservation. Critical shipping routes worth trillions of dollars go through these waters. Whoever controls them not only controls those dollars, but the ability for the countries in the area to access the resources. If China succeeds in closing the South China Sea shipping lanes, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and other American allies in the region would have a far harder time importing the resources they need. The same principle applies with China, however. A blockade of strategic shipping lanes such as the Strait of Malacca and the Strait of Luzon would cripple the commerce China depends on that comes through these straits, and much of its commerce is vital for its basic needs. While some of the Chinese missiles can reach that far, the assets being used to enforce the blockade would be better protected by distance and have more time to react to an attack. China is testing hypersonic missiles and is regarded as being ahead of the United States in the race for these weapons that would help its offensive reach. However, they are not ready for prime time and have not been widely deployed in the Chinese military yet. China would also greatly risk its naval and air assets in an attempt to disrupt the blockade. It would be the type of head-on confrontation with the United States Navy and Air Force that would put the Chinese military at a disadvantage. China may be the world's largest manufacturing nation, but it is still unable to feed or fuel itself, while the United States can. This would be the ultimate disadvantage in a wartime scenario, reminiscent of Germany's geographical disadvantages in World War I, when the Allied blockade deprived Germany of resources and slowly strangled it into starvation and submission. In a full-scale war, the United States would attempt a similar strategy. While China's missiles would ensure that the United States could not pull off a blockade in the same way the Royal Navy did in World War I, China would still be hard-pressed to break through it. So while the United States would be in danger in a confrontation in an area like the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, it would not necessarily need to go there until China is steadily worn down by the blockade and attrition. The United States still has a military advantage over China, but China is trying its best to close that gap. With its population starting to decline and economic growth slowing down, the dangers of a war breaking out in the Indo-Pacific may be increasing, since the Chinese communist leadership may begin to feel like its window of opportunity to remake the order in the region is closing. Regardless of how it would be fought, a war between the United States and China, even if contained, would be bloody and come at a huge price tag. Deterrence and diplomacy are more vital than ever. But what do you think? Who would have the advantage?
On April 1st, Israel is believed to have launched an attack on the Iranian consulate in Syria, an event that marked a massive escalation of tensions between the two countries. Iran lost one of its leading soldiers, Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Zahedi, in the attack, along with several commanders from its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran didn't take the attack lying down. Approximately 2 weeks later, Iran launched a terrifying combined missile and drone strike against Israel. Around 300 aerial threats were sent into the skies, targeting several Israeli locations, but most were shot down before they could do any real damage. But Israel wasn't alone in defending itself against the Iranian threat. As the US Department of Defense highlighted in an April 16 press release, it also took part in the defensive operation. Its Central Command forces, supported by destroyers the USS Karni and USS Ali, destroyed over 80 of the drones Iran launched, along with around 6 ballistic missiles. In doing so, the US may have played into Iran's hands. Following the attack, the prospect of war between Iran and the United States is higher than it's been in years. And in this video, we're going to theorize one way the war might happen, hour by hour and month by month. Hour 1. Deeper within the Sadabad complex, Iran's president, Ibrahim Raisi, feels as if he's starting to see his plans come to fruition. Mere days ago, he baited the United States into destroying some of its missiles and drones. Yes, that aerial assault targeted Israel, and he'd hoped to cause some damage against one of his greatest enemies in the Middle East. But his real goal was to tempt the United States into responding to his strike. Now he has justification for what he's planned. Raisi has spent over a decade cultivating relationships with Islamic insurgent groups throughout Asia. Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, even Hezbollah in Lebanon. All are on his payroll, receiving funds and equipment to carry out their attacks, and what Raisi provides allows him to use these smaller groups as proxies for his geopolitical goals while keeping his own hands relatively clean. But more important to him are the resources his ties to those groups provide. Not only can Raisi attack his enemies with these proxies while maintaining some level of deniability, but he can rely on them to insert combatants into countries he'd otherwise be unable to reach. Countries like the United States. Over several years, Raisi and his proxies have been sending agents into the United States. Some have been caught, but far more have managed to establish themselves as citizens of the country. They've just been waiting for their call to attack. Raisi provides it, but the attack doesn't come in the traditional military sense. There will be no fighting between Raisi's insurgents and the United States military. Instead, each will become a martyr, targeting locations throughout the United States where large numbers of people gather to wreak havoc and sow the seeds of terror in the country. Concerts, sporting events, malls, they're all targeted with synchronized attacks that result in the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, primarily the victims of suicide bombings or gunfire. At the same time, Iran attacks American interests closer to home. Missiles fly over the Strait of Hormuz, through which 33,000 ships, including American oil tankers, sail every year. The attack is devastating, destroying several oil tankers and cargo ships, though Raisi isn't able to take out the USS Bataan or the USS Carter Hall, both of which have been stationed in or near the strait since August 2023. That doesn't matter, he's happy to engage both in a naval battle after the fact. What mattered most was the statement. Ibrahim Raisi has just declared war on the United States. Hour 2. President Joe Biden and his most trusted advisors are scrambling. Over the last hour, they've received words of dozens of attacks on American soil, along with news of missiles targeting American commercial and oil vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. This is no coincidence. Intelligence briefings in the immediate aftermath of the attacks confirm what Biden already feared. All of the attacks can be linked to Iran. As data continues to flow in, the names of those who killed civilians on American soil and the nature of the missiles flying over the Strait of Hormuz, Biden comes to terms with the fact that the US is now at war. More is coming. Hour 3. Raisi doesn't take much time to relish in the success of his initial attacks. He needs to do all he can to prevent a hasty American response, which means turning his focus toward the country's regional allies, the United Arab Emirates, or UAE, and Saudi Arabia. Cyber warfare is the next step. According to America's own Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency's assessments, Iran represents a major cybersecurity threat to the rest of the world, primarily because of its willingness to conduct aggressive operations. State-sponsored malware and ransomware attacks are already common, but what Raisi has planned now will surpass anything Iran has done before. His crack team of computer experts has spent the last year infecting specific targets in Saudi Arabia and the UAE with a spin-off of the Menorah spying malware. Through that malware, Iran has established communication with several command and control servers on home soil, through which it compromises the infected systems to damage them at critical junctures. That malware's executables are running on overdrive today. Raisi's computer experts target the Al Dhafra Air Base, host to 5,000 American military personnel, just outside Abu Dhabi, shutting the base's communications and computer equipment down temporarily. The 10 bases the US has in Saudi Arabia are targeted with similar attacks, all designed to hamper communications and slow down the US response. However, Raisi doesn't send his troops into either country. To do so would be suicidal, as he doesn't have the resources to fight the Saudi and UAE militaries on top of fighting against the United States. He just wants to make his threat known. These attacks are his bargaining chip, one he's using to cow the United States into relinquishing the tightness of its grasp over Middle Eastern politics. Now all he has to do is sit back, bide his time, and wait for the American response. Hour 24. In the United States, President Biden has spent the last day working with his advisors to prepare America's counter to Iranian aggression. Normally, he'd rely on sanctions to force Iran to back down. It's a tactic that the US has used successfully in the past, and it has sanctions active now, but Biden knows that won't be enough this time. Nevertheless, his team has quickly drafted a new round of sanctions, primarily targeted at Iran's ability to export oil to other countries. If the US were able to put a dent in the 1.29 million barrels of oil Iran exports daily, it could hit Raisi in his pocket. That's unlikely to happen. Most of those barrels go to China, an Iranian ally, but even so, Biden implements the sanctions, and his partners in NATO follow suit. A little financial damage is better than none at all. More important will be his response to Iran's attacks in the Strait of Hormuz. After all, he knows that Raisi can't send his military onto American soil, so the US will have to engage him closer to home to show that it's simply not lying down and allowing the attacks to happen. Furthermore, he can't allow Iran to have control over that passage of water. Too much cargo and oil that's valuable to the United States passes through. He has to control it as quickly as possible, both to hurt Iran and protect America's interests. The USS Bataan and the USS Carter Hall are both on alert and have orders to attack any Iranian naval vessels they find. Biden also seeks help from the Combined Task Force, or CTF-150, a multinational force that includes ships from France, Germany, and the UK, to help him start the fighting early in the strait. That force contributes almost 15 ships, though Pakistan withdraws in an effort to stay neutral and will help Biden conduct a tit-for-tat naval battle in the strait and throughout the Persian Gulf until a stronger naval fleet arrives from the United States. With those early measures in place, Biden has to turn his focus to his own people. America was attacked on its own soil in multiple locations by terrorists who he now knows were funded and supported by Iran. Not only must he bring solace to a damaged nation, but he must prepare it for war. Week 1. As several American warships, in addition to 2 of its aircraft carriers, make the journey toward the Persian Gulf, Biden has been preparing for the next stage of his offensive. It'll take between 4 and 6 weeks for his ships to reach the Strait of Hormuz, which is why it's so crucial for CTF-150 to do its job now. Once they arrive, he'll institute a blockade, giving America control of the ships that sail through the strait, in addition to allowing him to position his aircraft carriers so that he can launch aerial assaults on Iran. America's Navy will be key to its victory, with 472 ships compared to Iran's 101, including 11 aircraft carriers to 0 for Iran and 45 more submarines. America knows it can come out on top in the Persian Gulf. Besides a handful of corvettes and frigates to support its 19 submarines, Iran's navy is mostly made up of patrol vessels. That will play against Raisi in the long term, as Iran will be able to do little to prevent America from taking the Persian Gulf and setting up blockades, but that will come in time. For now, Biden has to rely on the smattering of bases the US has set up near Iran. The country's bases in the UAE and Saudi Arabia are back up and running, giving Biden thousands of troops he could send to storm Iran. But he doesn't send that order. Instead, those troops are prepared to move to the coast lining the Saudi and UAE sides of the Persian Gulf. Once the US controls that stretch of water, it'll establish a through line using Saudi Arabia, through which it will funnel troops to transports in the Persian Gulf to ship them into Iran. America's alliance with Israel will also pay dividends. Iran's war with the US was triggered because of an attack on Israel. Now that America has officially entered the fray, Israel is more confident in its ability to directly declare war against Iran. It has backup. It's not going to fight alone. And now that Iran has launched such devastating and public attacks on the United States, popular support has started to lean in Israel's favor. So, as the UAE and Saudi Arabia provide the US with inroads into Iran via the Persian Gulf, Biden also sends ships and troops sailing through the Mediterranean to reach Israel. From there, America can launch aerial attacks and perhaps even send ships via the Red Sea into the Arabian Sea to cut off any support others might send to Iran. All in good time. For now, Biden simply has to wait for his Navy to arrive. Week 2. The tit-for-tat fighting in the Persian Gulf and particularly the Strait of Hormuz hasn't been going in Iran's favor. But it's not all bad news for Raisi. One of his submarines managed to sink the USS Carter Hall, taking out the small ferry-class dockship. But Raisi knows America's Navy is coming and he needs to do as much damage as he can, as fast as he can. That means turning to Iran's huge stockpile of missiles. According to Iran Watch, the country has around 3,000 ballistic missiles stockpiled, notwithstanding a growing collection of land attack cruise missiles. The country has also developed solid propellant missiles, allowing for faster firing and acceleration, and it's those missiles that'll be turned against the few American ships in the Persian Gulf right now. Khyber Shekan and Emad missiles are fired from silos on the Iranian mainland, capable of traveling 900 miles and 1,056 miles respectively. Those missiles can easily reach the American ships in the Gulf. They're backed by Shahab-3 missiles, which can travel 808 miles, as Iran launches a battery against the American ships. But Raisi doesn't stop there. Dozens of the Shahed-136 drones are sent over the Persian Gulf. These drones, which are the same as those Raisi used to attack Israel mere weeks ago, carry a small explosive payload that detonates upon impact with a target. They may not be strong enough alone to take out the USS Bataan, but when combined with the missile volley coming out of the country, that ship's anti-air defenses are soon overwhelmed. It sinks. And with further missile attacks coming, the dozen or so ships that are part of CTF-150 choose to withdraw to a safe distance. They've done their jobs, but now that Iran has shown a willingness to send missiles into what was previously a naval battle, they'll sit out until reinforcements arrive from the United States. Week 3. Raisi's plans have worked so far. He's retaken the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, even though he can only protect those waterways with patrol boats and a small fleet of submarines. That doesn't matter. He knows the US will take them both back when their full fleet arrives. What he's not so concerned about is whether the US will try a full land invasion once it secures the Persian Gulf. That would be unwise. Iran is the 18th largest country in the world in terms of pure land mass, and its geography makes trying to invade a treacherous prospect. The US can't enter from the east. That would mean going through Afghanistan, which the US recently exited, and essentially starting a second war. Add 2 deserts into the mix, and American troops will be ripe for the picking if they came from the east. A Western invasion is more possible thanks to America managing to convince Saudi Arabia and the UAE to allow it to use bases in those 2 countries to home in on the Persian Gulf. But the Zagros Mountains, which line much of Iran's western borders, means an incursion wouldn't be simple. If America wanted to land troops into the country, it would likely need to do so via the same water pass Saddam Hussein used when Iraq invaded Iran in the 1980s. But even that isn't a surefire thing. The invading forces would still run up against the Zagros Mountains, and that's after negotiating the swampy terrain in the southwest where the Tigris and Euphrates intertwine. Raisi believes his country is a fortress. With the Persian Gulf temporarily secured, he focuses on coordinating more terror attacks. Iran's proxies are being weeded out in the United States, but enough evade the authorities long enough to commit more bombings and shootings. Raisi knows those insurgents are a finite resource. With the US imposing strict restrictions on travel, it's unlikely that Iran will be able to sneak many more of its fighters into the country. But that's okay too. Those who are already there have done their jobs. The American people are panicking. They don't know where the next attack will come from. And Raisi feels that helping to build this panic could soon sap the country's appetite for war. Weeks 4 to 6. Biden has re-evaluated his plans slightly as his naval forces arrive to the Persian Gulf. Though he'll still send thousands of troops to supplement the military bases America has bordering the Gulf, those troops won't invade directly. That would just lead to more bloodshed than he believes is necessary, with thousands of Americans likely to be killed as they filter into Iran from the southwest. Instead, he'll send troops into Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, a constant presence to keep Iran on edge. The US chooses to respond to Iran's missile volleys in kind. As its ships arrive in the Persian Gulf, they set about the task of clearing the waterways of the patrol boats Iran has patrolling. The country's few corvettes and frigates are easy targets for America's destroyers, with the arrival of a small fleet of submarines proving more than a match for Iran's own fleet. Now in position, those ships prepare to fire missiles at select targets on the Iranian mainland. But they won't be the only form of attack the US leverages. Accompanying the fleet that takes the Persian Gulf are 2 aircraft carriers, the USS George H.W. Bush and the USS Gerald R. Ford. The latter carries over 75 aircraft, with the former carrying 60, and they'll be used to bring America's air superiority to bear. F-18 Super Hornets will make up the main attack force. backed up by Northrop Grumman E-2 Hawkeyes that will be responsible for conducting reconnaissance and helping the Super Hornets find targets on the Iranian mainland. When Iran inevitably sends its own jets into battle, Lockheed Martin F-35C Lightning fighter jets will engage Iran's fighters over the Persian Gulf. The goal is simple: attack from the water, using missiles fired from ships and America's huge fleet of jets to cow Iran into submission quickly. Week 7. Raisi expected all of this. He knows that Iran can't match the United States in terms of pure firepower. Its stock of 121 combat-ready fighter jets, along with 15 attack-type planes, will be overwhelmed by those flying from America's air carriers. If the US brings more carriers to the Persian Gulf, they'll gain full air superiority. But Raisi is far from being out of ideas. He's not looking to go toe-to-toe in a fight with the United States. He wants to use their aggression against them. After all, as accurate as American missile strikes may be, they're far from perfect. No concerted missile strikes are. Iranian civilians are already dying in blasts, images that Raisi is all too willing to use for propaganda purposes to strengthen the will of his people. Raisi also has China and Russia on his side, albeit not directly. China in particular is heavily dependent on the Strait of Hormuz for many of its goods. Though it won't pick a fight with the United States, Beijing has already started placing pressure on Washington to find a peaceful solution. Russia is also calling for restraint, arguing that an entire country shouldn't be punished for the actions of radicals. Raisi also benefits from both China and Russia having veto power as members of the United Nations or UN Security Council. Both use their vetoes, preventing the United States from obtaining global political legitimacy for the war via the UN. All of the while, Iran is spreading more chaos throughout the Middle East through its proxies. Hamas and Hezbollah maintain their focus on Israel, while the Houthis in Yemen grow ever bolder in their attacks on the Red Sea. The US has to divert at least some of its naval forces to that area. Though that won't be enough to substantially weaken its presence in the Persian Gulf, it allows Raisi to cast the United States as the controlling influence over the Middle East that he has always claimed it to be. Attacks also start occurring in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The Houthis play a part in the attacks on the latter, with funds and equipment having already been funneled out of Iran to allow for their attacks on Saudi airports and energy plants. Raisi is gambling. If he wins, he could induce a war weariness in the United States quickly, as well as use his proxy attacks to make Saudi Arabia and the UAE withdraw their support for America. Month 2. Biden sees that the war is already at a sort of stalemate. Iran is baiting the United States to invade its mainland, an action that Biden knows is extremely risky. If the US were to throw its full force into that invasion, it's inevitable that hundreds of thousands of people, both troops and civilians, will die. He also knows that the Iranian people have been galvanized against the US due to civilians having already died in American missile strikes. Even if the US takes Iran, absorbing all of the bloodshed that would involve, he sees the potential for leaving a power vacuum. Insurgent groups would splinter off and continue fighting in the country, resulting in America potentially facing a similar situation to what it saw in Afghanistan. But still, the US can't stay in its holding pattern forever. It's holding the Persian Gulf easily and has even taken steps to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to try and keep Beijing happy. Daily missile volleys and airstrikes are being conducted on Iranian targets, slowly whittling away at the strength of Iran's war machine. But Iran won't capitulate unless it faces the full power of an American invasion. And while the US holds the Persian Gulf, Iran's proxies are conducting terror attacks throughout Europe and Africa. If the situation isn't resolved soon, the US may have a global conflict on its hands, with other nations looking to it to help them fight against Iran-backed insurgents on their territory, spreading the country's resources even thinner. Iran is also making America's naval and air assaults costly. The country is more than capable of sinking ships using missiles fired from the mainland, with the US having lost over a dozen since it took control of the Persian Gulf. Biden is left with a choice. Does he listen to the many voices in the United States that are screaming for revenge following the terror attacks that engulfed the nation just 2 months before? If he does, that would mean committing well over 1 million soldiers to a ground invasion, almost 10 times that needed for the war in Iraq, and absorbing massive military costs. And even if the US wins that ground war, it would have to commit even more resources to controlling Iran. Or does he open a channel of communication with Raisi, which is something the US hasn't really had for years given its lack of physical embassy inside Iran, to negotiate the end of the war? That could result in his own people seeing him as weak, even given the attacks he's already launched on Iran, but it could also save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Month 3. Biden chooses the middle ground. America begins funneling troops into Iran via the southwest, with air support provided by its fighters and helicopters, enabling landings even amidst Iran's anti-air and anti-ship defenses. But at the same time, he opens communication with Raisi. He calls Raisi's bluff. Biden tells Raisi as much during their conversations, pointing out that the ground war will be more costly to Iran than the US. He lays everything out. Yes, the United States will lose troops and equipment in the fighting, but Iran will lose more. Slowly but surely, the United States will whittle away at Iran, taking cities and working its way to Tehran, where it will ultimately depose Raisi. Is that what he wants? Raisi had hoped for a conversation, but he believed it would be a one or the other situation. Even as he speaks with Biden, American troops are fighting their way further inland. His only option now, both to preserve Iran and maintain his leadership, is to compromise. He argues for the United States to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal, something that 72% of Americans supported before his country's attacks. He also tells Biden that he should cease America's support for Israel, leaving the country to fend for itself against Iran's proxies. Biden is prepared to do the former, but won't do the latter. Israel has long been an ally of the United States, but he can encourage Israel to come to the table and potentially negotiate a ceasefire of its own. He also tells Raisi that his proxies need to stop attacking commercial vessels in the Red Sea and that the Strait of Hormuz needs to be reopened for business. He also seeks promises. If Israel is to come to the negotiating table, Iran needs to approach the discussions without threats of fighting. Plus, American troops need to be guaranteed safe passage back out of Iran. Just one attack will be enough of a spark to reignite the conflict. Diplomacy has to win the day. Raisi contemplates his options and ultimately accepts Biden's proposal. The conflict isn't over, as relations with Iran are still in the balance. But Biden is at least able to start withdrawing American troops from Iran and has avoided getting the country sucked back into a Middle Eastern crisis that it's already too war-weary to control. Still, this is just one of the many ways that a war between the United States and Iran could go. And frankly, this may be the most optimistic of the scenarios available, especially when compared to the violence and bloodshed that would erupt from a full ground invasion. But what do you think? How would the war play out differently if the US committed to a ground-based assault? Could America take Iran and keep control of it? Or would a country that's been described as a fortress draw out the conflict until the United States withdrew?